Good day, everyone. Welcome to Deku Universe. Today we are beginning part 1 of What If Genius Deku Created the Ultimate Regeneration Formula. The fanfiction is created by Mr. Wonderking 12 on archiveofourown.org. Now let's begin. Izuku Midoriya held her newborn son for the first time and felt nothing at all. That was the part she would never say out loud. Not to the nurse still charting her BLD pressure at the foot of the bed. Not to her own mother, who would call that evening crying happy tears down the phone. Not to Hisashi, who was at that exact moment sprinting across 2 districts because his phone had buzzed mid-rescue with 4 words that had made his heart stop harder than any villain ever had. It's time. Come now. Izuku looked down at the small, furious, red-faced thing working itself up to its first real scream, and she waited to feel it. The thing the parenting books promised, the flood, the animal devotion that was supposed to rewire a woman from the inside out the second she saw her child's face. She waited. The machines beeped. The fluorescent light hummed. And nothing came. Instead, one small, cold thought surfaced, precise as a scalpel laid flat on a tray. A boy. She had known for weeks, somehow. Some women just could. She'd felt it in the way this PRGNCY had sat low and mean in a way she hadn't expected. And she'd caught herself, more than once, lying awake against Hisashi's broad, sleeping back with a hand resting on the swell of her own stomach, thinking the kind of thought a woman allows herself only in the dark, only in the silence of her own skull, because thoughts like that don't usually come due. If it's a girl, she'd told herself for months ago, staring at the ceiling, I will love her so much it frightens people. If it's a boy, she remembered finishing that thought so calmly it had almost scared her. I will make him wish he'd never been born. She had not expected to actually mean it, and yet here the bill was, small and screaming, and she found that she meant every word of it. There we go, Mrs. Midoriya, the nurse said warmly, adjusting Izuku's arm under the baby's head. Support him right there, good. He's already looking for you, you know. They can smell their mothers before they can even focus their eyes. Izuku arranged her face into the expression she'd rehearsed in the bathroom mirror for the better part of 9 months. Her voice, when it came, did something soft and warm that she had practiced saying to a reflection that could never call her a liar. Hello, she murmured, and even she was a little impressed by how it sounded. Hello, little one. The nurse smiled, satisfied, and made a small mark on her clipboard and did not see anything at all because there was nothing to see. That was the whole trick of it. Izuku had learned, somewhere in the long, private architecture of her own mind, that a performance only fails when someone is looking for the seams. No one ever looked. No one ever thought to. The door slammed open hard enough to bounce off the wall. Izuku, Hisashi Midoriya stood in the doorway in half a hero costume, one gauntlet still on, soot smudged across one cheekbone and the collar of his shirt scorched at the edges, chest heaving like he'd run the last mile of it. His eyes found the bundle in her arms, and every ounce of exhaustion went out of his face at once, replaced by something so unguarded it was almost embarrassing to witness. Is that a look at him? Look at the size of his hands. Izuku, he's got my hands. You reek of smoke, Izuku said, and let herself laugh, because that part at least wasn't hard. Hisashi laughing was easy to laugh along with. He had that effect on people. Gas main, he said, crossing the room in 2 strides and dropping into the chair beside the bed like his legs had simply stopped holding an opinion on the matter. Whole block on the east side. I was pulling an old woman's cat out of a collapsed stairwell when my phone went off, and I swear to every hero who's ever lived I have never run that fast toward anything. He reached out one huge, careful finger and touched it to the baby's impossibly small fist, and the fist, on pure animal reflex, closed around it. Hisashi made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite something else. Hey, little guy. I'm your dad. I'm so sorry I smell like a chimney. He doesn't mind, Izuku said. Do you, sweetheart? The word came out of her mouth clean and easy, like a coin she'd been carrying so long the edges had worn smooth. What are we calling him? Hisashi asked, not looking away from the baby's face. We never actually landed on one. You kept saying you wanted to see him first. Izuku, Izuku said. She'd had the name ready for months, in truth, ever since the LTRSND technician had gone quiet in a particular way and then very carefully not said anything at all, which had told her everything she needed to know before any doctor confirmed it. It means to grow, to nurture. I thought it suited him. Izuku. Hisashi tried it out like he was tasting it, and grinned, wide and sudden and completely without guile, the exact grin that had made Inko marry him in the first place, back when she still half believed that marrying a good man might be enough to make her one too. Izuku Midoriya. Yeah, that's good. That's really good, Inko. She smiled at her husband and meant absolutely none of it toward the small red thing between them, and felt, for the first time in the whole long ordeal of the last 9 months, something close to peace. The mask fit. It always would, as long as Hisashi never once thought to check the seams. Hisashi Midoriya was not, and had never claimed to be, a famous hero. He was a mutation-type user, hero named Salamander, and his quirk let his skin shrug off heat that would blister an ordinary man to the bone, let small wounds knit themselves closed in minutes instead of weeks, let him wedge his broad shoulders into gaps and crawl through spaces a human body had no business fitting through. It was not a flashy quirk. It did not throw enemies through buildings or fill the sky with light. It pulled people out of burning buildings and collapsed tunnels and overturned cars, one at a time, patiently, usually while the cameras were pointed somewhere else at somebody with a better silhouette. He had never once cracked the hero billboard chart. On the rare nights his own rescues made the news at all, they ran 40 seconds after the sports recap, sandwiched between weather and a segment about a cat stuck in a vending machine, and Hisashi would watch it with his dinner on his lap and laugh like it was the funniest thing in the world. Inko did not find it funny. You could be top 50, she said one evening, 6 months after Izuku was born, standing at the kitchen counter with her arms folded, while Hisashi bounced the baby gently against his shoulder. Endeavor's agency called again today. They want you for a joint rescue op next month, full camera crew, sponsored gear, the works. Do you understand what that could mean for us? I told them no, Hisashi said, not turning around, still swaying slightly on the ball of his feet in the rhythm that seemed to be the only thing that settled Izuku down when he fussed. You told them no. Inko, it's a publicity op. They want me standing next to Endeavor holding a hose while he does the actual work and gets the actual credit, and in exchange I get my face on a poster for 3 weeks. I don't need that. I need to be at the 6th ward tomorrow. There's a structural inspection on that apartment complex that's been putting me off for a month. You need to think about your family, Inko said, and here, for one unguarded second, something genuine slipped into her voice, because this part, at least, was true. She did think about her family. She thought about it constantly, obsessively, the way other women thought about diets or affairs. Sponsorship money is real money, Hisashi. It's Izuku's schooling. It's a house that isn't 40 years old. It's not why I do this. He finally turned, and his face wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. It was patient, the way you were patient with someone you loved who you thought simply hadn't understood you yet. I became a hero to help people who need help, not to sell energy drinks. I know that's not the answer you want, but it's the only one I've got. Inko looked at her husband. Good, uncomplicated, endlessly decent Hisashi, who had never told a lie in his life because he had never once needed to, and felt the familiar, exhausting mixture of love and contempt that she had stopped trying to untangle from each other years ago. She loved him. She also thought privately that his decency was a kind of stupidity, a refusal to reach for things that were sitting right there for the taking. It never once occurred to her that the same unflinching honesty that frustrated her about her husband was the exact thing that made it so easy to lie to him. Fine, she said, and softened her voice, and crossed the kitchen to lean against his arm and look down at Izuku's small, sleeping face. Fine. Save the world your way, then. She kissed the baby's forehead, right where Hisashi could see her do it, and felt nothing at all. And it didn't matter, because Hisashi was already smiling down at both of them like he'd never seen anything so perfect. If you had asked 6-year-old no. If you had asked anyone who spent even 10 uninterrupted minutes with small Izuku Midoriya what he wanted to be when he grew up, you would have gotten the same answer, delivered with the total, unembarrassed conviction that only very young children and very brave adults ever manage. A hero, he would say. Like Dad. Like All Might. His bedroom wall, by the time he was 3, had become a shrine. Crayon drawings, dozens of them, taped up in a haphazard mosaic that crept higher every month as Hisashi lifted him up to reach the empty spaces near the ceiling. A stick figure all might with an enormous yellow smile and hair drawn as 7 distinct triangular spikes. A green blob that was, Izuku insisted, his father mid-rescue, because Daddy's the green one, see, and that's the fire, and that's the lady he's saving. A whole sequence, done over a rainy weekend, depicting what Izuku had decided the inside of All Might's muscles must look like, all coiled springs and lightning bolts, based entirely on a single frame of grainy news footage he had made Hisashi rewind 11 times. Tell me the one where he saved the whole train, Izuku said one night, climbing into his father's lap with the specific, boneless trust of a small child who has never once had reason to be careful around the person holding him. Again? Hisashi laughed, but he was already settling back into the couch cushions, already doing the voice. Okay. So there's this train, right, and the brakes have failed completely, and it's headed straight for the end of the line where it's gonna. Say it like him, Izuku interrupted, solemn as a judge. You gotta say it like him. Hisashi cleared his throat, dropped his voice into the booming register that always made Izuku shriek with laughter, and said, Have no fear, for I am here. And Izuku collapsed sideways into the couch cushions in delighted hysterics. And from the doorway, unnoticed by either of them, Inko watched with an expression that would have been very hard for anyone to read. She did not hate the boy's hero worship. If anything, it was useful. It kept him occupied, kept him quiet, kept him out from underfoot while she managed the house and, increasingly, managed her own private calculations about what her life was going to look like once there was a second child in it, one she'd actually chosen. What she hated, what she could feel, even then sitting under her sternum like a swallowed stone, was watching her husband love this boy so completely, so easily, without a shred of the effort it cost her to fake even a fraction of it. It wasn't fair. Hisashi got to feel it for free. She had been performing it since the DLVRY room, and some days the muscles in her face genuinely ached from the effort of smiling at a child she felt nothing for. Soon, she reminded herself, on the nights it got hard to keep her face arranged correctly. Soon there will be someone in this house I don't have to pretend for. Izuku Midoriya arrived on a bright, ordinary Tuesday, and everything about her mother changed the second the doctor said the word girl. Inko held her daughter and felt it, the flood, the rewiring, every single thing the books had promised and that she had waited for in vain 2 years earlier. It came so fast and so completely that she actually gasped, and the sound she made when Izumi's tiny hand found her finger was not a performance. It was not rehearsed. It came from somewhere so deep and unguarded that Inko herself was almost frightened by the force of it. There she is, she whispered, and her voice cracked, actually cracked, in a way it never once had over Izuku's crib. There's my girl, Hisashi, standing at the bedside in his day clothes for once. No soot, no scorched collar, he'd actually made it in time for this one. Laughed with relief and wiped at his own eyes with the back of his wrist. Another Midoriya, he said. Inko, look at her. She's got your nose already, I swear. She's perfect, Inko said, and for the first time in her adult life, meant a sentence about motherhood with her whole chest. In the hallway outside, a nurse walked a curious 2-year-old Izuku toward the room so he could meet his baby sister, and Izuku pressed his small palms flat against the glass of the nursery window and stared at the rows of bassinets with the wide, serious concentration he brought to everything, trying to work out which pink bundle belonged to him now. That one, the nurse said gently, pointing. That's your sister. Izumi, Izuku said, testing the shape of the name the way he tested the shape of every new hero he learned about, filing it away with the same reverence. He didn't know yet. How could he? That he was looking at the one person in that hospital who was going to grow up loved without qualification, without cost, without a single second of the calculation that had gone into every soft word his mother had ever aimed in his own direction. He just pressed his hand harder against the glass and grinned, delighted at his new sister, and asked if he could hold her, please. He'd be really, really careful. 2 years slid by the way early childhood always does, in a blur of scraped knees and half-remembered birthdays. And then, on an unremarkable spring morning shortly after Izuku's 4th birthday, with Izumi not far behind him in age, tagging along for the same appointment. Hisashi Midoriya took the whole family to Mizuta General for the visit every parent in Japan eventually made, the quirk assessment. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and the specific brand of orange juice hospitals bought in bulk. Izuku sat swinging his legs off the edge of a plastic chair, clutching a small stuffed figure of All Might that had lost most of the yellow felt on one arm to years of enthusiastic hugging, while Izumi drooled contentedly on Inko's shoulder. "You nervous, buddy?" Hisashi asked, nudging his son's knee. "What if I get a quirk like yours?" Izuku said, eyes bright. "What if I can, not get burned and I can go into fires like you?" "You'll get whatever quirk you get," Hisashi said, "and it'll be perfect because it's yours. That's how it works." Inko said nothing. She was watching the door to the examination room with an expression of perfect, patient composure, and beneath it, in the private chamber of her mind where she kept the things she never said aloud, she was doing math. Let the girl have something extraordinary, she thought, stroking Izumi's back in slow, absent circles. Let the boy have whatever he has. It changes nothing about which one of them I actually love. Dr. Kitano called them back at 10:15. He was an older man, silver at the temples, with the particular gentleness of someone who had delivered this exact category of news, good and bad in roughly equal measure, several thousand times across a long career, and had never once managed to make it feel routine. "Let's start with the little one," he said, smiling at Izumi, since she's already awake and unhappy about it. The examination was quick and, for a while, unremarkable: reflexes, muscle tone, the standard battery of questions. Then Dr. Kitano produced a small RBB ball and set it on the examination table in front of Izumi, more out of habit than expectation. Most children her age didn't manifest anything detectable yet. He was reaching for his tablet to note as much when the ball trembled, lifted an inch off the steel table, and drifted, wobbling, toward Izumi's outstretched, delighted hand. The room went very still. "Well," Dr. Kitano said, recovering himself, and reached for a different instrument entirely, a compact scanner that read the density and reactive threshold of a quark's factor signature. He ran it over Izumi's small form twice, checked the readout twice, and looked up with the particular brightness doctors reserve for the rare, genuinely good surprises. "That's a very early manifestation. Very early. Mr. and Mrs. Midoriya, your daughter has what's called megalotelekinesis, an evolved telekinetic variant. Enhanced range, enhanced precision, and, notably, it scales her physical lifting capacity along with it. Some telekinetics can move a coffee cup across a room by the time they're teenagers. This reading suggests she'll eventually be moving furniture, possibly considerably more than furniture." Inko's hand, resting on her daughter's back, went very still, and then her whole face lit from within in a way that had nothing performed about it at all. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Izumi." She lifted her daughter and pressed a kiss to her temple, and laughed. Actually laughed, bright and unguarded, a sound Izuku had heard directed at his father plenty of times, but almost never at himself. "Did you hear that, sweetheart? You're going to be incredible." "That's amazing," Hisashi said, grinning ear to ear, reaching over to tickle his daughter's foot. "Absolutely amazing. Hear that, Izuku? Your baby sister's going to be able to move cars around someday." Izuku, still perched on the exam table's second chair, All Might figure clutched to his chest, beamed at his sister with total, uncomplicated pride. "That's so cool," he said. "Izumi's going to be a hero too." Dr. Kitano made his notes, ran his final checks, and then turned his attention, and his scanner, toward Izuku. He checked the boy's reflexes. He checked his hands, his forearms, the base of his spine, and then, with the specific, practiced gentleness of a man who had done this exact motion 1,000 times before, he lifted Izuku's small bare foot and examined the toes. 2 joints, not 3. Dr. Kitano set the foot down very carefully, and when he spoke, his voice had softened into the particular register reserved for exactly this moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Midoriya," he said, "I'm afraid I don't have the same news for your son." "What do you mean?" Hisashi asked, and Izuku, for years old and already sharp enough to read a room, went quiet and still on the exam chair, his fingers tightening around the worn felt of his toy. "There's no additional joint in the toe," Dr. Kitano said, "which is one of our earliest, most reliable indicators. Combined with the muscle fiber readings I'm seeing here, and no detectable quirk factor signature at all, I'm sorry. Izuku is quirkless. The word landed in the small room like something dropped from a height. That can't be right, Hisashi said, and for the first time that morning his voice had an edge in it, though not the edge of anger, the edge of a father scrambling, fast, to find the shape of a problem he could actually fix. Can you run it again? Sometimes it's late, right? Some kids don't show anything until they're 5, 6. We can absolutely run further tests as he grows, Dr. Kitano said gently. And I want to stress, this diagnosis is not a judgment on who your son is or what he'll become. Quirkless individuals are rarer than they used to be, but they exist, and they build full, meaningful lives. But based on what I'm seeing today, I'd be doing you a disservice if I told you to expect a different result later. Izuku looked down at his own foot, small and bare, and apparently wrong in some way he didn't have the words for yet, and then up at his father's face, searching it for whatever expression was about to tell him how bad this actually was. Hisashi crossed the small room in 2 steps and crouched down in front of his son's chair until they were eye level, and took both of Izuku's hands in his own enormous, calloused ones. "Hey," he said quiet only for Izuku. "Hey, look at me, bud. You hear what the doctor said? It's not who you are. It doesn't change one single thing about who you are. You're still my son. You're still going to grow up and do incredible things. I promise you that, quirk or no quirk. But I wanted to be a hero," Izuku said, very small, and something in his 4-year-old voice cracked in a way that made even Dr. Kitano look down at his tablet for a moment. "You can still be anything you want to be," Hisashi said fiercely, and pulled his son into a hug tight enough that Izuku's small face pressed into his father's shoulder. "Anything. You understand me? I don't care what a scanner says." Behind them, Inko sat very still with Izumi settled against her chest, her face arranged into an expression of appropriate maternal concern. A slight frown, a hand pressed lightly to her collarbone, the universal posture of a worried mother. And behind that expression, in the private, locked room of her own mind, something that had been waiting patiently for 4 years finally, quietly, unlocked. Quirkless, she thought, and felt a strange, cold satisfaction settle into her chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a still pond. Of course he is. Of course. She had made a promise to herself once, lying in the dark with a hand on her stomach, and for 4 years she had carried that promise around folded up small, tucked away, waiting for a reason, any reason, to finally take it back out. Now she had won, not just a boy she'd never wanted, a boy who would never be extraordinary either, a boy with nothing to offer the life she was building except the space he took up in it. Poor thing, she murmured aloud, reaching out to smooth Izuku's hair as Hisashi finally released him from the hug, and her voice was soft and warm and utterly, flawlessly false. "We'll figure it out together. Won't we, sweetheart?" Izuku, still hollowed out from the doctor's words, nodded against her hand and did not see anything at all in his mother's face, because there was nothing there for a 4-year-old to see. That was the whole trick of it. It had always been the whole trick of it. Hisashi's phone rang before they'd even made it out of the parking garage. Inko watched her husband's face change as he answered it. The automatic straightening of his spine, the shift into the particular alert stillness he wore whenever the call was work and not family. "Salamander," he said into the phone, and then a beat later, "How bad?" Okay, I'm 15 minutes out. Tell the fire crew to hold the east stairwell. I can get people out through the service tunnel." He hung up and turned to Inko with the apologetic when she'd seen 100 times before. "Gas explosion, residential block near the river. They need extraction support. It sounds bad." He crouched down again in front of Izuku, who was still clutching his felt all-might figure a little too tightly for a 4-year-old who was fine. "Hey, I gotta go be a hero for a little bit, okay? But I want you to know something." He tapped Izuku gently on the chest, right over his heart. "That doctor doesn't know everything. You hear me? Nobody gets to tell you who you're gonna be. Not a scanner, not anybody. I love you. I'll see you tonight." "Okay, Dad," Izuku said, managing a small smile for his father's benefit, because even at 4, some instinct in him already understood that Hisashi needed to see that smile before he could leave with a clear conscience. Hisashi kissed the top of his son's head, then Izumi's, then Inko's cheek, murmured, "Take care of them," and jogged off toward the parking structure's exit, already shrugging his jacket off his shoulders in preparation for the gear waiting in his car. Inko watched him go until he turned the corner, and then, for just a moment, standing in the concrete stairwell with a sleeping infant on one arm and a quiet, hollowed-out 4-year-old holding her other hand, she let her face finally rest. No performance, no warmth, just the flat, patient stillness of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this configuration. Husband gone, no one watching, and a reason at last that felt like permission. "Come along, Izuku," she said, and her voice had already changed, the warmth gone out of it like water down a drain. "We're going home." The car ride was silent. Izuku sat in his booster seat in the back, still holding his toy, watching the city slide by the window and turning the doctor's word over and over in his small mind. Quirkless, 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 trying to understand what it meant that he would never be able to do the things his father did, the things All Might did, the things his sister, a baby who couldn't even talk yet, was apparently already going to be able to do someday. He didn't notice his mother watching him in the rearview mirror the entire drive, her eyes flat and considering in a way they had never once looked at Izumi. They got home a little after noon. Inko set the still-sleeping Izumi down in her crib with a gentleness that came so naturally she didn't have to think about it at all, and then she came back out into the living room, where Izuku was sitting on the floor by the coffee table, quietly trying to make his All Might figure stand up on its one good leg. "Izuku," she said. He looked up. Something in his mother's face was different. He didn't have the vocabulary yet to describe what. He only knew, in the wordless, animal way small children register danger before they can name it, that the air in the room had changed, the way it did right before a summer storm broke. "Come here," Inko said. He came, because she was his mother, and because at 4 years old he had no framework yet for the idea that the word mother might not mean what he'd always assumed it meant. What happened next, Izuku would spend the rest of his life trying not to remember in detail, and would fail because the mind does not let go of the things it most wants to forget. He would remember the low-level, almost conversational tone of his mother's voice, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. He would remember her saying, quietly, without a trace of anger, as if she were simply explaining a fact of the world to him the way she might explain that the stove was hot. "You understand this is your fault. If you'd had a quirk, none of this would need to happen." He would remember the specific, structured DSBLN of it, calculated, careful, aimed at places a sleeve would cover. He would remember, more than anything, that she never once raised her voice, and that the silence in the house afterward was somehow the loudest thing he had ever heard. And when it was over, kneeling down to bring her face level with his, wiping his cheeks with a gentleness that made the last 20 minutes feel like something that had happened to a different child entirely, Inko Midoriya said the words that would become, over the following decade, the load-bearing wall of Izuku's entire childhood. "Your father can never know about this," she said, soft as a lullaby. "He loves you so much, Izuku. It would break his heart. And if you ever tell him, or anyone else, I will make sure he stops loving you too. Do you understand me?" Izuku, for years old, hiccuping, desperate for the version of his mother that had existed 30 minutes ago to please come back, nodded. "Good boy," Inko said, and smoothed his hair back from his forehead with the exact same gentle motion she'd used in the doctor's office that morning, and smiled at him with genuine, unclouded warmth, because in her own mind she had done nothing wrong at all. She had simply collected on a promise 4 years overdue. "Now go wash your face before your father gets home. We don't want him to worry." That night, after Hisashi came home smelling of smoke again, exhausted and triumphant from pulling 6 people out of a collapsing apartment block, after he'd checked in on both his children and kissed them goodnight and told Izuku, one more time, quiet, just for him, that no doctor's word was ever going to change how much his father loved him, Izuku lay awake in the dark long after the house had gone quiet. Then he got up, careful of the floorboard by his door that creaked, and crossed to the wall where 4 years of crayon All Mights and stick-figure salamanders and lightning bolt muscle diagrams were taped in their crowded, joyful mosaic. He took them down, all of them, carefully, so the tape wouldn't tear the paper, folding each one along its worn creases into a small, careful square. He didn't cry while he did it. Some instinct, newly born that afternoon and already fully formed, had already told him that crying wasn't safe to do where anyone might hear, and some other instinct, one that would define the rest of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine, told him that the things he loved most were the things he needed to hide the best. He found the loose floorboard under his bed, the one he discovered weeks ago while looking for a lost toy, and he tucked the small folded stack of drawings into the dark space beneath it and pressed the board back down flat and silent. Then Izuku Midoriya climbed back. In a bed for years old and already learning the first and most important lesson of his entire life, that the safest place for anything precious was somewhere no one else would ever think to look. And eventually he slept. By the time Izuku Midoriya turned 5, he had already learned the geography of his own house better than most adults ever learn the layout of a place they've lived in for decades. He knew which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent. He knew which hour of the evening was safe to be underfoot and which hour meant finding somewhere small and quiet to disappear into. He had learned to read his mother's face the way other children learn to read picture books. The particular set of her jaw, the particular flatness behind her eyes, cataloging the signs with more reliability than any weather forecast ever managed. He had gotten very good, in other words, at surviving. What he hadn't yet found was anywhere to put the rest of himself. The part that survival didn't use up. He found it on a Tuesday night in early spring, 3 weeks after his 5th birthday, when a bad night kept him from sleeping, and he crept down the stairs to the living room out of nothing more than a small child's instinct that the glow of a television screen was better company than a dark ceiling. He kept the volume low, one thumb already hovering over the power button in case he heard footsteps, and flipped through the channels until he landed on something that wasn't cartoons or infomercials. A documentary, narrated in the calm, unhurried voice reserved for programs that assumed their viewers were adults. Every living thing on this planet, the narrator said, over a slowly rotating animation of a blue, ladder-like spiral, is written in a language of only 4 letters. And for the first time in human history, we are learning not just to read that language, but to rewrite a sentence or two of it ourselves. Izuku sat very still on the carpet, 3 feet from the screen, and felt something shift inside his chest that he had no name for yet. He didn't understand most of what followed. The scientist explaining base pairs, the animation of a double helix unraveling and rejoining, the words recombinant and vector, and expression sliding past him too fast to catch. But he understood the shape of the idea underneath all of it, the way a much younger child understands the shape of a story, even when half the words are too big. Everything alive, every person, every animal, every quirk that let a hero fly or breathe fire or turn invisible, was written down somewhere, in some language, inside the smallest possible pieces of a body. And people were starting to learn how to read it. If you could read something, Izuku thought, sitting cross-legged in the blue light of the television at 5 years old, with a bruise fading yellow-green under his sleeve that no one but his mother had ever seen, then maybe, eventually, someday if you got good enough at it, you could learn how to fix it too. He didn't turn the television off until it started showing infomercials again. Then he crept back up the stairs, careful of the creaking board outside his door, and lay awake until morning turning the idea over and over, the way other 5-year-olds turned over a new toy. His teacher noticed within the month. Ms. Nakata had been teaching kindergarten for 11 years, which was more than long enough to recognize the difference between a bright child and something else entirely. Bright children finished the coloring sheet early and asked to help pass out crayons. Izuku Midoriya finished the coloring sheet in 90 seconds, then quietly worked his way through the entire stack of advanced readers she kept in a bin at the back of the room for the rare second grader who wandered in during library time. And when she finally sat him down with a battery of testing materials meant for children twice his age, he answered questions about fractions and paragraph comprehension with the calm, unbothered patience of someone doing a chore he found mildly interesting. Mr. and Mrs. Midoriya, she said, at the parent conference she'd requested with more urgency than she usually allowed herself. I want to be very clear that I don't say this lightly. In 11 years, I have had exactly one other student test this far outside the normal range, and he went on to skip 3 grades. I think Izuku needs to be somewhere that can actually challenge him, because right now, I promise you, we are wasting his time. Skip grades, Hisashi repeated, and then laughed. Not in disbelief, but in the specific delighted way of a man discovering his son had done something remarkable while he wasn't looking. That's wow. That's incredible. Izuku, did you hear that? You're too smart for your own class. I like my class, Izuku said, a little uncertainly, watching his mother's face for the signal that would tell him how he was supposed to feel about this. Inko's face, for the benefit of the room, arranged itself into an expression of gentle, proud surprise. Well, she said, reaching over to smooth his hair, aren't you full of surprises? Later that night, once Hisashi had gone back out on a call and the house had gone quiet, Inko sat Izuku down at the kitchen table with a different expression entirely, flat, assessing, the one he'd learned to watch for. You'll do the advanced work, she said. You'll skip whatever grades they tell you to skip. But you will not embarrass this family. If you're going to be strange, Izuku, you're going to be usefully strange. Do you understand? He didn't fully understand. Not yet, not at 5. What useful meant to a woman like his mother, or how much that single word was going to end up shaping the rest of his childhood. But he nodded, because nodding was safe, and because some small, calculating part of him, a part that hadn't existed 6 months earlier, before the blue glow of a television screen at midnight, had already noticed something his mother hadn't intended for him to notice at all. If I'm smart enough, he thought, she has to let me do it. Even she can't say no to something that makes her money. It was the first genuinely strategic thought of his life, and it worked so well that it would go on working, in one form or another, for the next 8 years. He skipped first grade entirely. Then, 18 months later, third grade. By the time he was 7, he was sitting in classrooms with children 2 and 3 years older than him. Small for his age, quiet, working through material that made his classmates groan with the same unhurried, faintly puzzled focus he'd once brought to a coloring sheet, as if the difficulty everyone else complained about simply hadn't occurred to him as an option. At home, Izumi grew up watching all of it happen. She was 6 by then, sharp-tongued and quick to tears in exactly the ratio that got her exactly what she wanted, and she had absorbed her mother's attention the way a plant absorbs sunlight, completely, without ever once having to ask twice. She had also, somewhere along the way, absorbed something else, the specific, casual cruelty that lived underneath her mother's smiles, the way children absorb an accent from the house they grow up in without ever consciously choosing to speak that way. Mom says you skip grades because you're weird, Izumi told him one evening, perched on the arm of the couch, watching him do homework 2 grade levels above his own with the particular boredom of a 6-year-old who has decided something is beneath her notice. Not because you're smart, because there's something wrong with your brain, and the teachers just want you out of their class. That's not what she said to Dad, Izuku said, not looking up from his notebook. That's what she said to me, Izumi said, with the smug satisfaction of a child who has just discovered the specific power of a secret. She reached out, carelessly, almost absently, the small telekinetic pull of her still-developing quirk, no stronger than a light breeze but growing every month, and flicked his pencil clean off the table, letting it clatter under the couch where he'd have to get down on his hands and knees to retrieve it. Oops! He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He had learned, by 7, that both of those things only ever made the ceiling of the house feel lower. So instead he simply got down and retrieved the pencil, and went back to work and said nothing at all. But that night, lying awake, a habit that was becoming permanent, whether or not there was a documentary worth watching downstairs, he thought about his sister and found, to his own mild surprise, that he wasn't angry at her. Not really. Not the way he was angry at his mother, a feeling that lived in him now like a low, steady hum he'd stopped noticing the same way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. Izumi hadn't chosen this house any more than he had. She had simply been born into the version of it that got loved, instead of the version that got hidden. If their mother had wanted a boy the way she wanted a girl, Izuku thought, with the strange, cold clarity that was becoming a permanent feature of his mind, Izumi might have grown up learning exactly what he'd learned. She was cruel because cruelty was the only currency this house had ever taught her was worth spending. It didn't make the flicked pencil hurt less, but it meant he couldn't quite bring himself to hate her for it. And some quiet, decent part of him, the same part that had once wanted, more than anything on earth, to be a hero, decided, without any fanfare at all, that he never would. He graduated high school 2 months after his 9th birthday, in a gymnasium full of 18-year-olds who had spent the last 3 years watching a child work circles around them with a mixture of awe and quiet resentment that Izuku had gotten very good at not noticing. He gave the valedictory address in a cap and gown 2 sizes too large, rolled at the cuffs by his mother's careful hands that morning, standing on a wooden box behind the podium so the microphone would reach him. "Most of you," he said, in a voice that hadn't dropped yet and wouldn't for years, but that had already learned to carry itself with the flat, precise confidence of someone twice his age, "are probably wondering how a 9-year-old ended up giving this speech instead of one of you. I've wondered that too, honestly. I don't think I'm smarter than anyone in this room in any way that actually matters. I just found something early that I couldn't stop thinking about, and I followed it as hard as I could for as long as I could because it turned out to be the one thing that made the rest of my life make sense." He paused, and for just a moment, so brief that almost no one in the gymnasium caught it, his eyes found his mother's face in the 3rd row, and something old and private passed behind them before he continued. "I tell you all to find that thing too, whatever it is, because once you find it, it stops being the reason people think you're strange, and it starts being the reason you get to leave." The applause afterward was long and a little bewildered, the specific applause reserved for something that everyone recognizes as remarkable without quite being able to name why. Hisashi, in the 3rd row beside his wife, was openly crying, both hands pressed over his mouth. And when Izuku found him in the crowd afterward, he picked his son straight up off the ground and swung him in a circle hard enough that the oversized cap went flying. "You did it," Hisashi said, voice thick, setting him back down and gripping his shoulders like he needed the contact to believe it was real. "Izuku, my son, 9 years old. I don't even have the words. I'm so proud of you I could burst." "Thanks, Dad," Izuku said, and meant it completely, in the specific way he meant almost nothing else in his life anymore. Cleanly, without calculation, without the constant low hum of watchfulness that colored every other interaction in the house. Whatever else was true about his life, his father's pride had never once, not one single time, been a lie. Beside them, Inko accepted congratulations from a small crowd of other parents with practiced grace, her hand resting on Izuku's shoulder for every photograph, her smile warm and radiant and entirely for the cameras. A prodigy, she was already thinking, beneath the smile, running the numbers the way she'd been running them for years now. A prodigy is worth something. A prodigy is an investment that's finally starting to pay out. It didn't occur to her, not even for a second, that the boy under her hand might have understood, with total clarity, exactly what she was thinking, and might already be building an entire life's plan around getting far enough away from her that it would never matter again. Kesho Institute of Advanced Sciences accepted him into its graduate program 4 months later, on the strength of an entrance thesis on inducible gene expression that 2 separate faculty reviewers initially assumed had been plagiarized from a working researcher, until they checked the author's date of BRTH and had to sit with that information for a while. The years that followed blurred, in memory, into a single long corridor of lecture halls and laboratories and late nights spent hunched over a microscope in a borrowed lab coat that someone eventually had tailored down to fit him. He earned his first PhD, molecular biology, a month after his 10th birthday. Genetics followed within the year. Then biochemistry, then virology, then genetic engineering, then immunology, then computational biology, each one arriving with less fanfare than the last. Until by the time reporters started actually showing up to his dissertation defenses, he'd stopped being surprised by the flashbulbs and started simply working around them, the way you'd work around bad weather. It was Dr. Curtis Connors who changed the direction of all of it. Connors held the Kesho Institute's endowed chair in comparative regenerative biology, a field so narrow that Izuku had assumed, walking into his first seminar at 11 years old, that he'd be one of perhaps 4 students in the room who actually cared. Instead, he found a packed lecture hall, and a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sketching a rough diagram of an axolotl's limb bud on the whiteboard with the kind of unself-conscious enthusiasm that made half the room lean forward without quite meaning to. "Here's what keeps me up at night," Connors said, tapping the diagram. "This animal can lose an entire leg, bone, muscle, nerve, everything, and regrow a perfect, functional replacement in about 6 weeks. No scar. No rejection. It just grows back. And it's not magic. It's not some special axolotl-only miracle. It's gene expression. Every single cell in your body carries the same basic genetic toolkit this creature is using. The genes for it are sitting in your own DNA right now, dormant, switched off millions of years ago because your ancestors found a better use for that energy budget. The axolotl didn't gain an ability we don't have. We lost one it kept. He set the marker down and looked out over the room with an expression that was almost hungry. The question I've spent my whole career on is simple. If the SWCH is still there, even switched off, can it be switched back on? Izuku raised his hand before he'd fully decided to. What if the SWCH isn't binary, he said when Connors nodded at him, startled. He hadn't expected a question that sharp from the 11-year-old in the third row, whoever he was. What if it's not on or off? It's more like a dial that's been turned all the way down instead of removed. If you could find what's actively suppressing it instead of just looking for what's missing, you wouldn't need to build the pathway from scratch. You'd just need to stop blocking the one that's already there. The lecture hall went very quiet. Connors stared at the boy for a long moment, then laughed, a real, delighted laugh, and said, "What did you say your name was?" That conversation became a standing invitation to Connors' private lab, which became a mentorship, which became, over the following year, something closer to a genuine friendship between a brilliant, restless boy who had never once in his life had an adult take his ideas seriously without an agenda attached, and a scientist who had spent 2 decades chasing a dream most of his colleagues privately considered an appealing waste of a career. "Everyone thinks I'm chasing a party trick," Connors admitted one evening, the two of them alone in the lab long after the rest of the building had emptied, a habit Izuku had come to treasure precisely because no one there ever wanted anything from him except good ideas. "Regrow a finger, whatever, nice research grant, cute headline. But I don't think that's what this is. I think if we ever actually crack this, really crack it, not just in a lizard, in a human body, we don't just fix fingers. We end disability. We end degenerative disease. We change what it means to grow old." He looked over at Izuku, 12 years old by then, hunched over a centrifuge with the fierce, private concentration that had become his permanent expression. "You're the first person I've ever met who doesn't laugh when I say that out loud." "I don't think it's funny," Izuku said quietly. "I think it might be the only thing in the world actually worth doing." He didn't say the rest of it, didn't say that some nights, working late in this lab that had become the only place on Earth he ever felt like the version of himself he was proud of, he thought about a 5-year-old on a living room floor learning that broken things could, in theory, be fixed, and felt something in his chest that was very close to grief for that kid and very close to hope for everyone else. He didn't say it because he had learned, a long time ago, that some things were safer kept exactly where the crayon drawings had gone. Folded small, hidden well, and never once mentioned out loud. Dr. David Strom found him instead of the other way around. Strom was Kesho Institute's Dean of Translational Research, a title that meant, in practice, that his job was turning promising science into fundable science, and he had been watching Izuku Midoriya's rising star with the specific, calculating attention of a man who had spent 30 years learning to recognize a once-in-a-generation opportunity before anyone else in the building did. 12 years old, Strom said, settling into the chair across from Izuku's desk uninvited, the week after Izuku's 9th published paper hit International Science Press. With 9 doctorates, an H-index that would make department chairs twice your age weep, and from what Kurt tells me, an idea that could fundamentally end human disease as we understand it. And you're doing it all inside somebody else's institute, on somebody else's grant money, publishing under somebody else's letterhead. He smiled, warm and easy, the smile of a man who had made this exact pitch dozens of times and refined it into something close to an art form. "Doesn't that bother you even a little?" "I hadn't thought about it that way," Izuku said, which was mostly a lie. He had thought about almost nothing else for the last 2 years, in the particular quiet hours after everyone else had gone home. "Think about it now, then." Strom leaned forward. "What if you didn't have to share a letterhead with anyone? What if there was a laboratory built entirely around one project? Your project, Kurt's project, the regeneration work, with no departmental politics, no grant committee telling you which experiments are too ambitious to fund this quarter, no dean above you except the one you choose to answer to. I can get you the seed investors. I've got relationships with 3 separate venture groups who'd crawl over broken glass to get in early on something with your name attached to it. All I'm asking in exchange is a board seat and the chance to help build something extraordinary." He extended a hand across the desk. "What do you say, Dr. Midoriya? Ready to stop working for someone else's dream?" Izuku looked at the offered hand for a long moment and thought. Not about the money. Not really, though the money mattered more than he liked to admit, since money was the one language his mother had ever consistently respected, about a locked door he could finally build for himself. A place with his name on it. A place no one could walk into uninvited, where the only person deciding what happened inside those walls would be him. He shook Strom's hand. GeoCorp, the insinuation of advanced technological and genetic research, opened its doors 8 months later, on Izuku's 12th birthday, in a gleaming new research campus on the northern edge of the city that Strom's investors had built faster than anyone in the industry believed possible, fueled entirely by the specific gravitational pull of a boy genius's name on the letterhead. Connors came with him, trading his endowed chair for a laboratory with an unlimited materials budget, and, for the first time in 20 years, a research partner who could keep pace with every idea he'd ever had to shelve for lack of funding. "To the future," Strom said at the small, press-heavy ribbon-cutting ceremony, raising a glass of champagne he'd insisted on despite Izuku's age, toasting instead with sparkling cider poured into an identical flute. "To ending human suffering, one broken thing at a time." Izuku raised his own glass and smiled for the cameras and thought privately that Strom had gotten the phrase almost exactly right without understanding the half of it. One broken thing at a time. He had been fixing broken things or dreaming about trying to since he was 5 years old on a living room floor. He had simply never had the resources to fix anything bigger than himself. That changed 6 months later in a private lab meeting after hours, when Connors laid out the full scope of the axolotl Ankomoto and gecko genetic package he'd spent 2 decades assembling in pieces, and Izuku, staring at the projected genome maps with a particular stillness that meant his mind was already 3 steps ahead of his mouth, said the sentence that would end up defining, and eventually ending, all 3 of their lives. "We're thinking about this wrong," he said. "We keep trying to graft the regenerative pathway on top of the human genome, like an attachment. But the human genome already has the suppressed version of this pathway, sitting inside it, dormant, exactly like you said in that lecture 2 years ago. We don't need to build anything new. We need something that can find the specific mammalian breaks, P53, the usual suspects, and hold them open just long enough for the dormant code to finish what it's already trying to do." Connors was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, the same delighted, hungry laugh from the lecture hall 2 years earlier. "A key," he said slowly, "not a graft. A key that unlocks what's already there." "A key," Izuku agreed, and something settled into place behind his eyes that neither Connors nor Strom, watching from across the table, quite recognized as the exact expression of a boy who had spent his entire childhood wanting, more than anything else in the world, to be able to fix what was broken. They named the project Prometheus that same night. Strom, predictably, was already drafting the press language before the meeting ended. The failures came first, as failures always do, though it took the world outside GeoCorp's walls a long time to hear about any of them. LRM-1, injected into laboratory rats with trembling, hopeful precision, achieved genuine regeneration, and then simply refused to stop, the dormant pathway roaring back to life with no mechanism to shut itself off again, until the animals developed grotesque, benign tumors along every scar line they'd ever carried, bone calcifying and thick, ropey overgrowth wherever an old injury had once healed. Izuku spent 3 nights in a row in the animal facility after that one, watching the monitors, unable to sleep, turning the failure over and over until Connors finally found him there at 4 in the morning and gently steered him home. "It's not a failure," Connors told him in the car. "It's data. Every single one of these is data we didn't have yesterday." "Tell that to the rats," Izuku said, quiet, staring out the window, and Connors, who had learned by then not to push when the boy got like this, said nothing at all for the rest of the drive. LRM-4 and LRM-5 introduced the first crude version of what would eventually become the Prometheus key, and produced Regeneration, real regeneration, alongside a cascade of side effects that made even Strom's relentless optimism falter. Aggression in test subjects that hadn't shown a violent instinct in their lives, patches of skin roughening into something unmistakably, horribly scale-like, metabolism spiking into territory that cooked the animals from the inside out within days. Izuku novelized every failure in a private notebook he kept separate from the official lab records. Not because he was hiding anything from Strom or Connors, but because some old habit, 5 years deep by then, still needed a place to put the things that felt too much like grief to say out loud in a boardroom. LRM-6 came closest. A chimpanzee named Baxter, missing his left arm since BRTH, regrew a complete, functional limb over 4 days that made even the most jaded venture investor in the observation gallery go pale with wonder. Until the new arm began to tremble, uncontrolled, a neurological echo that never fully resolved, and Baxter's own immune system, weeks later, began quietly attacking the very tissue his body had just built, as though some deep animal part of him understood, even if the science didn't yet, that something about the new limb wasn't entirely his. "We're close," Izuku told the board at 14 years old, standing at the head of a conference table full of adults 3 and 4 times his age, his voice steady in a way that had stopped surprising anyone in that building a long time ago. "We're not there, but we're close. Give me 6 more months." It took closer to 8, and a complete redesign of both the viral vector's protein shell and the Prometheus key suppression mechanism. Before LRM-7, the version Strom had already, privately, started calling the Phoenix formula in the pitch decks he was drafting for the eventual IPO, showed the first fully stable, fully controlled regeneration in a primate test subject, with no observable adverse effects beyond a temporary, manageable spike in metabolic rate. They ran the trial 9 more times. 9 more times, it worked exactly as designed. The night before Alistair Finch was scheduled to become the first human being in history to receive an injection of LRM-7, Izuku sat alone in his office long after Connors and Strom had gone home, reviewing the final safety data for what felt like the 100th time, the way he had once reviewed his mother's face for warning signs he couldn't afford to miss. Every number came back clean. Every simulation resolved exactly as designed. There was nothing left to check, and still he sat there, 14 years old, in a lab coat that finally, after all these years, fit him properly, staring at a wall of green nominal readouts and feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly, and not doubt. Something quieter than either of those. Something that felt, if he let himself sit with it too long, almost like the specific, watchful stillness of a boy standing in a kitchen doorway, learning to read a room before he knew what was about to happen in it. "You're being paranoid," he told himself, and shut off the monitor, and went home to a house where, as always, his mother's face would already be arranged perfectly by the time he walked through the door. Tomorrow, a man named Alistair Finch would sit down in a reinforced examination chair and place his life, and the ghost of his missing arm, entirely in the hands of a 14-year-old boy who had spent his entire childhood trying to prove that broken things could be fixed. Alistair Finch hadn't slept the night before he was scheduled to grow a new arm, and neither, 3 floors above him in a corner office with its lights still burning at 4 in the morning, had the boy who was going to give it to him. Izuku sat at his desk with the final safety report open in front of him for what had to be the 90th time, though he'd stopped bothering to count sometime around midnight. Every column was green. Every simulation had converged on the same clean result. He'd run the numbers so many times that the digits had stopped meaning anything at all, the way a word repeated too many times starts to sound like nonsense. And still some old, stubborn part of him, the part that had once learned to read a room for danger before it had the words for what danger was, refused to let him close the file and go home. "You're being paranoid," he told himself again, the same sentence he'd been telling himself for 2 weeks straight, and for the 90th time he didn't quite believe it. At 6 that morning, showered and dressed in the lab coat that finally, at 14, fit his shoulders instead of hanging off them, he walked the service corridor down to the pre-op holding room instead of going straight to the observation theater, because some instinct told him that if he was about to change a man's life forever, the least he owed that man was 5 minutes of looking him in the eye first. Alistair Finch was sitting up in the hospital bed, already in a gown, working a RBB stress ball with his one remaining hand with the restless, repetitive motion of a man trying to burn off nerves he didn't want anyone to see. He was 53 years old, built like someone who'd spent 30 years hauling hose and pulling people out of buildings that were actively trying to kill them, with a face that had clearly done a lot of laughing once and hadn't gotten as much practice at it lately. He looked up when the door opened and broke into a grin anyway. "Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," he said. "Or the kid of the hour, I guess I should say. You sleep at all, Doc? You look like hell." "Not really," Izuku admitted, pulling the room's single chair closer to the bed. "You." "Not a wink." Finch turned the stress ball over in his palm. "Spent most of the night thinking about my daughter, actually. Lily. She was 6 when I lost this thing." He nodded at the stump under his gown, "and she used to ask me every single night for about a year if the doctors were going to fix my arm, and I'd tell her doctors couldn't do that kind of thing. Not really, not all the way. And now here I am, 53 years old, about to sit in a chair and let a 14-year-old prove me a liar." He laughed, short and a little disbelieving. "She's 22 now. Got a fella she's serious about. I got a boat sitting half-built in my garage that I started the summer before the accident, and I never could finish it one-handed. Not the way I wanted, and I used to think a lot of things I stopped letting myself think." He looked up, and for just a second the joking dropped away entirely. "You really think this works, kid? Not the board. Not the investors. You." Izuku held his gaze and didn't reach for a rehearsed answer. "I think it works exactly the way we designed it to," he said. "I've checked everything I know how to check. I wouldn't be here if I thought there was a real chance of it going wrong." It wasn't a lie. It was also, he would think much later, not quite the whole truth, and some part of him already knew the difference even as he said it. "Good enough for me," Finch said, and held out his one hand. Izuku shook it. "Go finish that boat with me sometime, when this is all done. I'll teach you how to steam bend a plank. Bet nobody at that fancy institute ever taught you that." "Nobody ever did," Izuku said, and meant the small, surprised smile that followed more than he'd meant almost anything he'd said in that building in months. The observation theater filled up fast that morning. Strum in a suit sharp enough to have been pressed specifically for the cameras that would be waiting outside by noon, Connors beside him in his usual rolled-up sleeves. A handful of GeoCorp's senior board members clustered near the back, murmuring to each other about valuation projections in a way that made Izuku's jaw tighten every time he caught a fragment of it. "Look at that," Strum said, watching Finch settle into the reinforced chair below through the triple-pane glass, rubbing his hands together like a man arriving at his own birthday party. "Textbook baseline vitals. History, gentlemen. We're about to write it. He's a person, David," Connors said, not for the first time that month, not a headline. "He can be both," Strum said, entirely without irony, and Izuku, standing a few feet off with his tablet already lit, found himself thinking that this exact sentence, delivered with this exact untroubled cheer, was maybe the most honest thing Strum had ever said in his presence. He walked to the sterile containment unit himself, keyed in the access code, and watched the unit hiss open to reveal the single auto-injector resting on its velvet cushion. The fluid inside wasn't the sickly green of every monster movie he'd half-watched as a kid before his mother decided he was wasting time better spent studying. It was pearlescent, soft, swirling faintly with an iridescence that looked, if you squinted, almost gentle. "The Phoenix Formula," Strum murmured, more to himself than to anyone. "Pure poetry." Izuku lifted the injector with hands that had learned, over the last 2 years, to stay perfectly steady no matter what his chest was doing underneath, and looked once more at the bank of monitors, and once more at the man in the chair below, who caught his eye through the glass and gave him a thumbs up with his remaining hand. For one unguarded second, the 14-year-old boy genius disappeared completely, and there was only a child looking at the future he was about to unleash into the world, hoping with everything he had that it was the future he thought it was. Then the mask came back down, the way it always did, and he walked into the medical bay. "Dr. Midoriya," Finch said. "Man of the hour. They keep telling me." "Lead researcher," Izuku corrected gently, swabbing the scarred stump with practiced hands. "Dr. Connors and Dr. Strum are just as essential to this as I am. Today we're all the men of the hour, Mr. Finch. You most of all." He pressed the injector's tip against the densest ridge of scar tissue. "You'll feel warmth first, then tingling. That's the retrovirus beginning cellular dedifferentiation. Your body's starting to unlearn the scar and remember what it's supposed to be underneath it. Don't be alarmed. The soft click of the injector releasing its payload was, in Izuku's memory forever after, one of the loudest sounds he had ever heard. Injection successful, Connors called out, eyes locked on the readouts. Vitals holding steady. Wait. Heart rates climbing. 90. 105. 120. Metabolic rates spiking right alongside it. Strom added, leaning so far into the glass his breath fogged it. Body temps up 3 degrees already. He's burning fuel like a furnace. It's working, Kurt. Look at that curve. Below. Finch gritted his teeth as a sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead. Whoa, okay. Yeah. That's more than a tingle. Document. The skin around the stump flushed a deep, furious red, and something that might have been steam or might have been an optical trick of the overhead lights seemed to rise faintly off the injection site. The jagged, old lines of scar tissue began to soften at their edges, blurring the way wax blurs near an open flame. Look at that, Strom said, pointing at the microscopic feed. Cellular reversion is active. We've got pluripotent stem cells forming in real time. My God, the boy actually did it. Izuku stayed exactly where he was, at Finch's side, eyes locked on the injection site, ignoring the noise rising behind the glass. He watched 22 years of scar tissue break down and get quietly repurposed by a body that finally, after 2 decades, remembered how to do something it had forgotten it could do. I can feel it, Finch gasped, eyes wide, somewhere between terror and wonder. It feels hungry, like it wants something. That's your body preparing to heal itself the way it was always supposed to, Izuku said, keeping his voice level and anchor. Breathe with me. Your own DNA is the blueprint here. The formula's just the construction crews showing up to build it. And then it happened. At the exact center of the newly smoothed stump, a small, pale bud of new flesh pushed itself into existence. No bigger than a fingertip, trembling faintly, and then impossibly beginning to grow. We have guided redifferentiation, Connors breathed, and when Izuku glanced up through the glass, he saw the older man had a hand pressed flat over his own mouth, tears tracking freely down his face. 20 years of a career most of his colleagues had quietly written off finally paying out in front of him. We have regrowth. Izuku, we have regrowth. Over the next hour, in front of a gallery that had gone almost completely silent with the specific reverence usually reserved for churches, the bud of flesh lengthened, thickened, split into the nascent structure of bone and muscle and threading vasculature, growing in real time in a way no camera crew in the building would ever manage to fully capture, because some things simply had to be seen with your own eyes to be believed. Finch cried. Strom was already on the phone with the board, his voice climbing towards something that wasn't quite professional anymore. Connors just stood there weeping, openly, unashamed, watching 2 decades of his life's work finally bear fruit in front of him. Izuku Midoriya walked quietly back into the observation theater, past all of it, and stood in front of a single monitor in the far corner that no one else in the room was looking at. It was the genomic integration diagnostic, the one that tracked in real time the stability of the viral vector as it wove itself into Finch's rebuilding cells. An endless scroll of green text, nominal, 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 running down the screen faster than a human I should have been able to read it. And then, for less than a full second, one line flashed red. Error. P53 inhibitor linger. Deviation. 0.01%. Corrected. Did you see that? Izuku said quietly, to no one in particular. Strom, still flushed with triumph, waved a hand without even looking over. Sensor ghost, Izuku. A data hiccup. Don't let a phantom spoil the best day of your career. We did it, boy genius. We actually did it. Izuku didn't answer. He kept staring at the spot on the screen where the red line had been, long after it had scrolled away into the archive, long after the system's own safety protocol had caught the deviation and corrected it exactly the way he designed it to. The reins had held. The chariot hadn't so much as lurched off course. But for 1/10,000th of a second, they had slipped. And in the cold, quiet, analytical part of his mind that never fully switched off, a question began to form that he would not be able to put down again for the rest of his life. What happens the next time they don't just slip? What happens when they snap entirely? He found Connors alone in the animal facility that night, doing rounds he didn't strictly need to do himself anymore, and told him about the flag. Connors listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was one of the things Izuku had come to love about him. He never once treated a 14-year-old's worry as something to be managed or smoothed over, only as data, the same as anything else. 0.01%, Connors repeated slowly, leaning against a cage rail. That's about as small a deviation as a system can register and still call it a deviation at all. I know, and the safety protocol caught it, corrected it, exactly the way you build it to. I know that too. Izuku scrubbed a hand back through his hair, a habit he'd picked up from his father without ever noticing he'd done it. But it's the trend I can't stop thinking about, Kurt. That's the first deviation we've ever recorded on a live human trial. What happens the next time the load on the system is bigger? A localized injection into scar tissue is one thing. What happens when we're running this systemically through an entire bloodstream against a target that's actively fighting back, like cancer? Connors was quiet for a long moment, watching one of the axolotls drift lazily in its tank, the same species whose dormant genetic code was, right now, 3 floors up, teaching a grown man's arm how to grow bone again. I'll flag it in tomorrow's report, he said finally. Full transparency, every anomaly, no matter how small. We slow down before we scale up. That's the deal I can promise you, and I'll fightstrom on it if I have to. He looked over, and something gentle and tired crossed his face. You did an extraordinary thing today, Izuku. Don't let one flashing light take that away from you tonight. Just don't let it stop bothering you either. The day it stops bothering you is the day I start worrying. It never made it into a report that anyone with real power actually read carefully, because the 7 weeks that followed did not leave much room in anyone's schedule for careful reading. Alistair Finch's new arm, fully weight-bearing and indistinguishable from his original except for a faint shimmer of new, unweathered skin, was announced to the world on a Tuesday morning press conference that GeoCorp's PR department had been quietly preparing for a month. By Wednesday, Izuku Midoriya's face, round-cheeked, green-haired, absurdly young, was on the front page of every major news outlet on 3 continents, under headlines that range from the reasonably accurate, "The boy who ended disability," to the wildly overblown, "I asked this child the next All Might," which made Izuku laugh out loud, alone in his office, for the first time in weeks, because whatever else he was, he had never once been anybody's symbol of hope for anything. GeoCorp's valuation tripled inside a month, then tripled again. Strom, giddy with the kind of momentum Izuku had never seen in him before, started fielding calls from 3 separate national governments within the same week, all of them asking the same essential question in different diplomatic language. How fast can this scale? And who gets it first? The military liaisons arrived on a gray Thursday in early autumn, 3 of them, in dress uniforms so crisp they looked freshly unwrapped, touring the main lab floor with the specific, careful attentiveness of men evaluating an asset rather than admiring a miracle. Trauma medicine is the application that interests us most directly, the ranking officer said, watching a looping video of Finch's regrowth timeline on the wall display with an expression Izuku found difficult to read. You understand what this could mean for a soldier who loses a limb in the field, what it could mean for burn casualties. We'd want to discuss priority access, should the human trials continue on schedule. They're not scaling to systemic application yet, Izuku said, a little too quickly, and felt Strom's hand land warm and heavy on his shoulder before he could say anything more. Dr. Midoriya means to say we're being careful, Strom said smoothly, which of course we are. But I don't think anyone in this room doubts where the science is headed. General, why don't we discuss timelines over lunch? Izuku watched them walk off together, and felt, for the first time since he was 5 years old lying awake with a floorboard hiding 4 folded drawings beneath his bed, something close to genuine dread. His mother attended the GeoCorp 5th anniversary gala 3 weeks later in a dress that had clearly cost more than most people's monthly rent, and stood at the center of a small, admiring circle of reporters near the champagne fountain, glowing with a warmth that Izuku, watching from across the room in a suit that still didn't quite fit right on his 14-year-old frame, recognized instantly as entirely real. Not performed, genuinely, unmistakably real, for the first time he could remember, directed anywhere near him at all. Except it wasn't really directed at him. It was directed at the version of him that made good copy. "What's it like?" one reporter asked, pen poised. "Raising a son this gifted. Did you always know he'd do something extraordinary?" "From the moment he was born," Inko said, laying a hand over her heart with practiced grace. "I knew Izuku was going to change the world. A mother simply knows these things. We've always nurtured his gifts, his father, and I never pushed, only supported. That's all any parent can do, isn't it? Give a child room to become who they're meant to be." Izuku, close enough to hear every word, kept his champagne flute of sparkling cider raised in a polite, unbothered smile for the benefit of anyone watching, and felt something in his chest go very quiet and very still, the way a held breath goes still right before it's released. He had learned, a long time ago, precisely how much weight to give his mother's public voice, which was none at all. He simply hadn't expected, even after all these years, that hearing her say, "We've always nurtured his gifts" out loud to a room full of strangers would still be able to land somewhere so exactly, precisely tender. He excused himself early that night and told Connors, waiting for him by the coat check, that he had simulations to run before morning. He wasn't lying about that part either. The simulations had, in fact, been keeping him up more nights than not for the better part of a month. Localized application, a limb, an organ, a contained injury site. The vector behaved exactly as designed, every single time, across thousands of iterations. But every time Izuku modeled a systemic application, the kind Strom kept pushing toward in board meetings, the kind the military kept circling with barely disguised hunger, the math told him something he didn't like. The vector wasn't static. It learned. Not consciously, nothing so dramatic as that, not yet, nothing his simulations could actually prove rather than merely suggest, but the retroviral payload adapted its integration strategy at the molecular level every single time it encountered resistance, the way water finds the path of least resistance down a hillside without ever once deciding to. Against a small, contained wound, the P-53 brakes only had to hold for a matter of hours. Against a full-body malignancy, a cancer actively fighting for its own survival, spreading, mutating, resisting, the brakes would need to hold for days. Maybe longer. And every model Izuku ran showed the same faint, troubling trend line. The longer the brakes stayed engaged, the more the vector's own adaptive code seemed to treat them not as a boundary, but as an obstacle to be solved. He brought the data to Strom's office on a Monday morning 3 days before Elias Vance was scheduled to receive his injection, and laid it out on the desk between them with the specific, careful thoroughness of someone who already suspected he wasn't going to be listened to. "I am formally advising we postpone this trial," he said. "We need to recode the Prometheus key from the ground up before we attempt systemic application on a living human being." Strom didn't even look up from the folder for the first several seconds. And when he did, his expression carried the specific, indulgent patience of a man who had already made his decision weeks ago and was simply waiting for the room to catch up to him. "Postpone," he repeated. "Izuku, the press conference is scheduled for tomorrow. We have 3 separate generals flying in specifically to see this. The board approved systemic trials 2 weeks ago based on the localized data. We are not postponing. The localized data doesn't extrapolate the way you think it does." Izuku pressed. "A stump isn't a whole bloodstream. A scar isn't a malignancy fighting to survive. If the vector treats sustained resistance as a problem to route around instead of a boundary, we don't know what it routes toward." "And I have a man downstairs," Strom said, and here, for the first time, real heat entered his voice, dying, slowly, of a cancer that has already eaten through 2/3 of his pancreas, who has signed every consent form we've put in front of him, who has begged to be first in line for this because the alternative is a hospice bed and a morphine drip and a death nobody in this building would wish on their worst enemy. Are you telling me we let that happen because of a rounding error in a simulation?" "I'm telling you a rounding error is exactly how the last one started too," Izuku said, quieter now but no less firm, and it corrected itself because the stakes were small enough that it could. Connors, who had been standing silently by the window through the entire exchange, finally spoke. "Izuku has a legitimate point, David. Pushing to a systemic application before we understand the anomaly pattern is reckless. And you know it's reckless. You're just choosing not to say that word out loud in front of the board." "It's not reckless, Kurt, it's revolutionary," Strum snapped, standing now, gesturing broadly as if the whole city outside his window were somehow part of the argument. That man downstairs is going to die a slow, agonizing death whether we act or not. We have a chance, a real chance, to not just save his life but erase the disease that's killing him from his body entirely. Tell me what the moral high ground looks like from where you're standing, because from where I'm standing it looks a lot like two brilliant men letting a dying man die out of an abundance of caution. The room went silent. Izuku looked at Connors, and Connors looked back at him with an expression that said, as plainly as words could have, "I've lost this one, and I'm sorry, and I don't know how to win it either." "The board has approved it," Strum said, quieter now, final. "The patient has consented. The world is waiting, Izuku." He looked the boy in the eye, and for just a moment something almost gentle crossed his face. Not doubt, never quite doubt, but something adjacent to it. "Administer the formula, doctor." It wasn't a request. Izuku understood that the way he'd understood, a long time ago, that some rooms simply didn't have an exit that let you keep everyone happy. For one brief, terrible second, he looked like exactly what he was underneath the 9 doctorates in the magazine covers. A child, being told by an adult with more institutional power than he had that his fear didn't outweigh a stranger's hope. Then the weight of the room settled over him the way it always did, and he nodded, once to Connors, who moved to prep the 4-line with hands that were noticeably less steady than usual. Elias Vance's wife, Grace, was waiting in the family lounge 2 floors below the lab when Izuku passed through it on his way to the observation theater that morning, and something made him stop. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-40s maybe, with the specific hollowed-out exhaustion of someone who had spent the last 8 months watching a person she loved disappear one PND at a time. She was clutching a paperback novel she clearly hadn't read a single page of, and when she saw Izuku's lab coat, she stood up so fast the book fell to the floor. "You're the doctor," she said. "I saw you on the news. You're the one who's going to." "I'm part of the team, yes," Izuku said, and found himself crouching to pick up her fallen book before he'd quite decided to, handing it back to her with both hands the way his father handed things to people. Careful, deliberate. "Mrs. Vance, I want you to know we've prepared as thoroughly as it's possible to prepare for something like this." "He's not scared," Grace said, and her voice cracked right down the middle of the sentence. "That's the thing. He's not scared at all. He keeps telling me it's a coin flip between 2 kinds of dying, and one of them might actually work, so why wouldn't he take it?" She pressed the book to her chest like a shield. "I'm the one who's scared. Is that stupid? I'm the one sitting down here being scared for both of us." "It's not stupid," Izuku said, quiet, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything he'd said inside that building's walls. "I'll come find you myself after. However it goes. I promise you that." He would keep that promise in the end, though not remotely in the way he intended when he made it, and not for a very long time. The main lab floor, an hour later, was electric in a way the smaller observation theater from Finch's trial had never been. GeoCorp executives and military liaisons packed into a soundproofed upper gallery, their faces lit blue by a bank of live data feeds, the low murmur of anticipation rolling off them like heat off pavement. Elias Vance lay sedated on the central operating table below, a web of 4 lines and monitor cables tethering him to a dozen different machines, his face slack and gaunt in a way that made him look older than his years. Izuku stood before a massive holographic display showing a slowly rotating model of the man's genome, riddled through with flashing red instability markers that had multiplied noticeably even in the 3 days since his last full simulation run. "The instability is persistent," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the room. "In the Finch trial, we observed a 0.01% deviation. Every simulation since has shown that margin growing, not shrinking. The vector isn't malfunctioning. It's adapting. It's treating our genetic safeguards like a problem to solve instead of a boundary to respect. And it corrects itself every time, my boy," Strum said, beaming in a suit pressed sharp enough for the cameras waiting outside. "A self-refining system, more elegant than we ever designed it to be." The board's ecstatic. Preliminary IPO valuations already sitting in the trillions. "Trillions of dollars won't matter if we can't control it," Izuku said, shrugging the hand off his shoulder before Strum could land it there. "The board has approved," Strum said, and there was no more room left in his voice for further argument. The patient has consented. Administer the formula. Izuku's hands, for the first time in longer than he could remember, were not steady when he turned to the console. He initiated the automated infusion anyway because there was in that moment, in that room, nothing else left that he was permitted to do. The pearlescent LRM-7 formula began threading its way into Elias Vance's bloodstream, and for the first 60 seconds it looked, unmistakably, like a miracle. "Look at that," Strom shouted, pointing at a rapid cycling bioscan. Tumor markers in free fall. The vectors targeting the malignant cells with near-perfect precision. Apoptosis is climbing past 90%. On the monitors, the dark, spreading masses of cancer that had colonized Elias Vance's pancreas and liver and the lymph nodes threading up through his chest began to dissolve in real time, like sugar surrendering to water. In the gallery above, someone started to applaud, and the sound spread, rippling, and for one entire minute Izuku Midoriya allowed himself the smallest, most fragile flicker of hope that his math had simply been wrong. Then the screaming started. It wasn't a human sound. It began as something high and metallic, a shriek of pure biological agony that seemed to come from somewhere underneath language entirely. And Elias Vance's body arched off the table with enough sudden, violent force to snap the leather restraint across his chest clean in half. Every monitor in the room blared red in the same instant, the same message stamped across a dozen screens at once. Cascading genomic failure. "What's happening?" Connor shouted, already moving toward the table. Izuku's face had gone completely white, his eyes locked on the data stream scrolling past faster than any human I should have been able to parse it. And yet he parsed it anyway, in the cold, terrible clarity of a mind that had spent 9 years learning to read exactly this kind of language. "The inhibitor didn't disengage," he said, his voice cracking down the middle. "It integrated permanently. The Prometheus key didn't just unlock the brakes, it shattered them. There's nothing holding the pathway back anymore. It's cellular anarchy. It's rewriting everything." Vance's scream devolved into something wet and gurgling, and his skin, already pale from months of illness, began to mottle, shifting toward a waxy, grayish-green that spread visibly in real time up from his chest toward his throat. His veins bulged dark beneath the surface, no longer carrying red, but something thick and black. The rhythmic beep of his heart monitor collapsed into one long, flat, piercing tone as his human heart seized, and then a horrifying half-second later, jolted back into a violent, stuttering rhythm entirely its own, as though something underneath his ribs was learning how to be a heart from scratch. "Shut it down!" Strom was screaming now, all his earlier certainty gone, his voice cracking with a panic that had never once touched it in 20 years of ambition. "Shut it down! Shut it down now! There's nothing left to shut down!" Izuku shouted back, and his voice broke completely for the first time in years. "It's in his DNA, David. It doesn't matter what SWCHI flip. It is him now." A security team burst through the lab's outer doors in full tactical gear, rifles raised, but they were already too late by the time their boots hit the tile. With a wet, splintering sound of bone reshaping and cartilage tearing loose from its moorings, Elias Vance's arms and legs elongated on the table, the proportions of his body warping toward something that no longer quite fit the word human. His jaw unhinged with a sound like a green branch snapping and reformed, wet and glistening, into the crude wedge of a reptilian snout. One eye clouded over entirely, the pupil narrowing into a vertical slit. His fingernails thickened and darkened and sharpened into something closer to claws than nails, and then in one single fluid motion that made the two nearest guards stumble backward, the thing that had been Elias Vance sat up. It looked at the armed men in front of it not with fear, but with something worse. Curiosity, interest, the way a predator looks at something it hasn't decided yet whether it wants to eat. Fire, the lead guard, a broad-shouldered man named Reyes who had done 2 tours overseas and thought he'd already seen the worst the world had to offer, barked, and the lab erupted in gunfire. The rounds tore into the creature's flesh in a spray of dark BLD, and for one instant Izuku let himself hope the guns would be enough. Then the wounds began to smoke faintly at the edges and close. Not fully, Not cleanly, but fast enough that the creature barely staggered under the impact of 8 rounds that should have dropped a grown man 3 times over. It let out another shriek, this one carrying a note of pure fury instead of pain, and moved. It didn't lunge like an animal. It moved like something that had already, in the space of 10 seconds, learned the exact geometry of the room and calculated the fastest line between itself and the nearest warm body. It slammed into Reyes before the guard could get a second burst off, claws punching through his tactical vest as if the reinforced fabric were wet paper, and the sound that followed, wet, final, over almost before it began, was one that would live behind Izuku's eyes for the rest of his life. "Dr. Strong!" Connor shouted, grabbing the older man's arm and hauling him bodily backward as the thing turned. BLD, and something darker dripping from its jaw, its remaining clouded eye finding Strom across the chaos of the room with an unmistakable, horrifying spark of recognition. It knew him. Somewhere, underneath the shattered ruins of Elias Vance's mind, something in that creature understood exactly whose voice had said the words "administer the formula," and it charged. Connors threw his full weight into Strom's shoulder a half-second before the creature's claws would have taken the man's head off, the two of them tumbling clear as 4 deep, smoking gouges tore into the steel wall exactly where Strom's skull had been. The lab dissolved into total chaos, the emergency lockdown protocol screaming to life, blast doors grinding down from the ceiling on hydraulic tracks that had never in the building's short history been called upon to actually close, a younger guard named Kessler firing wildly and missing everything except a bank of monitors that exploded into sparks behind the creature's shoulder. The thing that had been Elias Vance tore through what remained of the security team with a speed that made every one of Izuku's careful projections feel, in retrospect, laughably optimistic. BLD, and something viscous and black spattering across pristine white walls and polished chrome equipment, the screams of dying men blending with the shriek of the lockdown klaxons until the two sounds became almost indistinguishable. A wounded scientist, crawling desperately for the nearest exit, slipped in a spreading pool of the creature's own infected BLD, the black fluid seeping into a deep gash torn across his shin by a stray round. And within seconds his own screams joined the chorus, his body beginning, in real time, to convulse and change. The outbreak had begun, and it had taken less than 90 seconds. "Izuku, move!" Connors was hauling a bleeding, hyperventilating Strom toward a side exit, screaming over the alarms, one hand outstretched toward the boy still frozen in front of the console. "We have to get out now." But Izuku hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he'd been standing, watching the monster he had built with his own 2 hands finish dismantling the world he'd spent his entire short life trying to construct, watching the wounded scientist's screams change register into something that wasn't fully human anymore and understood, with the terrible, complete clarity of a genius mind that had never once, in 14 years, been wrong about a pattern it recognized. Exactly what was about to happen to everyone in this building, and then inevitably to everyone beyond it. His mind rebooted. Terror gave way, all at once, to a single overriding instinct that had nothing to do with self-preservation at all. Data. He didn't run for the exit with Connors. He sprinted, instead, straight for his primary server terminal, the origin point of every line of code that had led to this room, this moment, this horror, and slammed a high-capacity encrypted drive into the port with hands that had finally, terribly stopped shaking because there was no longer room in him for anything except the single task in front of him. He initiated an emergency transfer and watched the progress bar begin, agonizingly, to fill. The source code for LRM-7. Every simulation. Every failure log from LRM-1 through LRM-7. The full genetic architecture of the thing that was, right now 20 feet behind him, learning how to kill. The cause of the coming apocalypse, and if anyone ever anywhere found a way to stop it, its only possible cure. The transfer bar crawled forward at a pace that felt like it belonged to a different, slower universe than the one currently collapsing around him. Behind him, he heard the creature finish with the last of the security detail and go still for one terrible listening second, and then heard it turn. "Izuku." Connor's voice, raw and desperate, from the doorway. The transfer bar hit 100%. Izuku ripped the drive free from the port At the exact instant the creature's claws swiped through the space where his shoulder had been a half-second earlier, close enough that he felt the wind of it against his cheek, close enough to smell copper and something sour and reptilian underneath it. He didn't look back. He clutched the drive to his chest like the single holiest object left in the world and threw himself toward the closing blast door, sliding the last several feet across a floor slick with things he refused to let himself identify, and made it through the narrowing gap with less than a foot of clearance to spare, the massive steel slab sealing shut behind him with a sound like the world's largest door finally closing on something it should never have opened in the first place. He didn't stop running until his lungs gave out 3 corridors later, and even then he only stopped because his legs simply refused to carry him any farther. 14 years old, drenched in a stranger's BLD that wasn't entirely a stranger's BLD anymore, Izuku Midoriya sat down hard against a wall in an empty service corridor, clutched a hard drive containing the whole of his life's work against his chest, and understood, with a clarity that would never again fully leave him for as long as he lived, that the boy who had walked into that lab that morning was already gone, buried somewhere behind that blast door along with everyone who hadn't made it out. He was no longer a scientist. He was a survivor. And, whether the world beyond those walls understood it yet or not, he was already the father of a plague that was only just beginning to draw its first breath. The corridor lights were still on when Izuku forced himself back onto his feet, which somehow made everything worse, a bright, clean, fluorescent-lit hallway, exactly the way it had looked every single day for the last 2 years, now playing host to a sound that had no business existing inside it at all. Somewhere above him, through 3 floors of concrete and steel, he could hear screaming that didn't stop when it should have stopped, the kind that just kept climbing until it wasn't really screaming anymore, just noise a human throat happened to be making. He ran. The drive was zipped into the inside pocket of his lab coat, pressed flat against his chest, and he kept one hand pressed over it the whole way down the service corridor, as if letting go of it for even a second might make it disappear. He didn't make it to the stairwell before he found out exactly how fast this thing could move through a building. A knot of GeoCorp accounting staff. People Izuku recognized by face, if not by name. People who'd smiled at him in the cafeteria 100 times. People who had absolutely nothing to do with any lab on any floor, were clustered at the base of the emergency stairs, and one of them, a woman in a cardigan who Izuku was almost certain organized the building's monthly birthday cake rotation, was on the ground convulsing, her co-workers backing away from her in horrified confusion because none of them yet understood what convulsing meant here, in this building, today. "Get back!" Izuku shouted, and something in his voice, 14 years old, cracking, but carrying the specific, terrible authority of someone who had just watched exactly this happen twice already that morning, made 3 of them actually listen. The other 2 didn't. The other 2 were still crouched over her, one with a hand on her shoulder, saying her name when her spine arched off the tile floor, and her jaw unhinged with a wet crack that Izuku would hear again in his sleep for years afterward. He didn't stay to watch what happened next. He couldn't have said, later, whether that made him a coward or simply someone who understood, faster than anyone else in that stairwell, that staying to watch wouldn't save a single life and might cost him the one thing that could eventually save millions. Izuku. Connors caught up with him 2 flights down, Strom stumbling along a half-step behind, BLD soaking through the sleeve of his suit jacket from a gash Izuku hadn't noticed him get. The older man's face had gone the color of old paper. "There's people still on 4," Connor said, breathing hard, already turning back toward the landing they'd just come down. "The East Wing offices, the ones that don't have badge access to this stairwell, they're going to come out into the lobby and run straight into whatever's loose down there without any warning at all." "Kurt, don't," Strom started, and Connors cut him off with a look that Izuku had never once seen on the man's face before. Not in 2 years of late nights in the lab together. Not in any of the 100 small kindnesses that had made Connors feel, at times, like the only genuinely safe adult Izuku had ever known. "Get him to the airfield," Connors said, not to Strom, to Izuku, gripping his shoulder hard enough to hurt, his eyes locked on the boy's with an intensity that made Izuku's chest go tight. "You hear me? Whatever's on that drive, it's the only thing in this entire building worth more than a human life right now, and you are the only person who understands it well enough to keep it that way. Get out. Get somewhere safe. And when this is over, and it will be over someday. Izuku, I need you to believe that you use what's on there to fix it. That's the job now. That's the whole job. Kurt, you can't go back up there alone. I'm not asking permission, Connors said, and for just a second, under the fear, something almost like a smile crossed his face. The same expression he'd worn in that first lecture hall, sketching an axolotl's limb bud on a whiteboard, hungry and unafraid and entirely stubbornly himself. 20 years I spent chasing a theory nobody thought was worth funding, kid. Turns out the theory works. Turns out I finally get to spend it on something that matters. He squeezed Izuku's shoulder once hard and let go. Go. Now. Don't you dare wait for me. He was already moving back up the stairs before Izuku could find a single word to say, taking the steps 2 at a time, and the last Izuku ever saw of Dr. Curtis Connors was his broad back disappearing around the landing above, shouting something toward the 4th floor door that Izuku couldn't make out over the alarms, already reaching to pull it open. He never came back down. The airfield sat 2 miles east of the main GeoCorp campus, a private STRP Strom had insisted on building during the company's first flush of investor money. Mostly so board members wouldn't have to suffer the indignity of a commercial terminal. And Izuku had thought, at the time, that it was an obscene waste of funding that could have gone toward a 3rd round of primate trials. He would never again, for the rest of his life, complain about a waste of funding. Strom made it as far as the parking structure with him before the crowd took him. It happened fast and stupidly, and without any of the drama the moment deserved, a surge of fleeing staff funneling into the same stairwell at the same time, someone screaming that something was coming, the specific mindless physics of 200 terrified people trying to occupy the same 8 feet of space at once. Izuku felt Strom's hand slip out of his grip in the crush, heard him shout something that might have been the boy's name, and then the crowd simply closed over the space where the man had been standing and didn't open back up. Izuku fought against the current for almost a full minute, shouting, before some older, colder part of his brain, the part that had been keeping him alive for the last 2 hours, told him flatly that Strom was already gone either way, swallowed by the crowd or by something worse, and that stopping to find out which would only add his own name to the list. He didn't stop again until he reached the airfield. The GeoCorp jet was still fueled and idling on the tarmac. Its pilot, a woman named Officer Reina Castillo, who normally flew board members to shareholder meetings and had absolutely no protocol on file for a 14-year-old boy sprinting across the runway alone, drenched in BLD that wasn't his, clutching an encrypted hard drive to his chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Dr. Midoriya, she started, and then took one look at his face and simply stopped asking questions. Where? Texas, Izuku said, and his voice, when it came out, sounded strange to his own ears, flat, hollowed, already starting to become the voice he would carry for the rest of his life. Austin, as close as you can put this thing down. That's not on the flight plan. There's no flight plan anymore, Izuku said. There's no anything anymore. Please. Something in the way he said it. Or maybe just the sound of the alarms still screaming from the campus behind him, or the smoke that had, in the last 10 minutes, begun rising in 3 separate places across the skyline, made Officer Castillo nod once, hard, and wave him up the stairs without another word. He sat alone in a cabin built for 12, staring out the window as the jet lifted off and the GeoCorp campus fell away below him. His laboratory, his life's work, the building where he had spent every waking hour of the last 2 years trying to fix something broken, now wreathed in smoke and lit, here and there, by the specific orange flicker of small fires that had nothing to do with any explosion, only with buildings that had simply been left to burn once everyone inside them stopped being able to put them out. He watched it shrink to the size of a coin, then a speck, then nothing at all, and somewhere over Ohio he finally, quietly, without a single sound, began to cry, for Connors, for the wounded scientist in the lab whose name he'd never even learned, for Alistair Finch and his half-built boat, for a version of himself that had existed that morning and would never exist again. By the time the jet began its descent toward a small private airfield outside Austin, he had stopped. There would be time to cry again, he suspected. There would be a great deal of time for that, eventually. For now there was only the hard drive and the address of a house he'd visited exactly 4 times in his life, and the boy who lived in it. The world did not fall all at once. It fell the way a line of dominoes falls, slow enough, at first, that you could almost convince yourself you were only watching the first few tip, and then all at once, everywhere, too fast for anyone to find the SWCH that might have stopped it. An infected GeoCorp executive named Preston Cole, bitten in the initial chaos on the third floor and too disoriented by fever to understand what was happening to his own body, made it out of the building, into his car, and onto a connecting flight before the sickness fully claimed him. He collapsed on the jet bridge for Flight 713 to Dallas, Fort Worth, thrashing, foaming, already beginning to change in ways the paramedics who reached him had no framework for understanding, and by the time anyone thought to ask the question that actually mattered, had this man been in contact with anyone else on this flight before he collapsed? The answer no longer mattered either, because Flight 713 had already landed an hour earlier. Its 140 passengers had already disembarked, and the plague had already found its second epicenter 3 states away from its first. From there, it was simple math, and the math did not care how smart anyone involved happened to be. Every connecting flight out of DFW that afternoon carried at least one passenger who had unknowingly stood near, or breathed the same recycled cabin air as, or brushed hands in a jet bridge with someone who was, by the time their own plane touched down somewhere else entirely, already carrying the virus in their BLD. Every bus terminal, every rideshare pickup line, every crowded highway rest stop became, without anyone choosing it to be, a new distribution point. Within 18 hours, 3 major cities had confirmed cases. Within 36, that number had climbed past 20. By the time the world's slowest-moving institutions, the CDC, the WHO, a dozen national governments still holding emergency meetings behind closed doors, finally agreed on language urgent enough to broadcast publicly, the window in which any of it might have mattered had already closed. The news called it the green fever, because no one outside a handful of increasingly frantic GeoCorp executives yet understood what it actually was, and because the earliest confirmed footage, grainy cell phone shot, uploaded and re-uploaded faster than any platform could take it down, showed exactly what the name suggested: skin gone waxy and mottled, eyes clouding to a sickly yellow-green, bodies moving with a jerking, feverish wrongness that made even seasoned news anchors visibly struggle to keep their composure on air. Authorities are still working to determine the origin of what's being called a rapid-onset viral outbreak, one anchor said, on a broadcast that would run, in various forms, on nearly every channel in the country within the same 48 hours, her voice carrying the specific, brittle calm of someone reading words she did not yet believe herself. Some researchers have speculated this may represent an entirely new category of quirk manifestation, though the CDC has not confirmed this theory. We want to stress that residents in affected areas should remain indoors, avoid contact with symptomatic individuals, and await further instruction from local authorities. There would be no further instruction in most places, because within 72 hours of Elias Vance's transformation on a lab table 3 states away, every major city in the country had reported confirmed cases, and the authorities meant to provide that instruction had, in most of those cities, already stopped answering their phones. Izuku found the Miller house exactly where he remembered it. A modest 2-story on a quiet street lined with live oaks. A basketball hoop bolted crookedly over the garage door. A half-disassembled engine block sitting under a tarp in the driveway that Tommy had been fussing over for the better part of a year. It was the 4th time in his life Izuku had ever set foot on this street, and each of the previous 3 had been a good day. A rare, uncomplicated afternoon spent handing Tommy wrenches while the older boy talked, without a single trace of intimidation or performance, about carburetors and gear ratios and a girl named Priya who sat 2 rows ahead of him in chemistry, treating the world's youngest lead researcher like nothing more remarkable than a slightly odd friend who happened to be good at explaining things. Tommy's father had introduced them, 3 years earlier, on a facility tour of GeoCorp's Texas logistics hub that Strom had insisted Izuku personally attend for the cameras. While the adults toured the warehouse floor discussing supply chains and shipping manifests, a 16-year-old Tommy Miller, visiting his dad's work on a school holiday, bored out of his mind, had wandered over to the strange, quiet boy nobody else seemed to know how to talk to, glanced at the tablet in his hands, and asked with total, uncomplicated curiosity, "What's that supposed to be, some kind of virus map?" It was, in fact, exactly that, and Izuku had spent the next 40 minutes explaining it to someone who had absolutely no scientific background and absolutely no agenda beyond genuine interest, and had gone home that night feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like something other than a specimen. He hadn't expected the friendship to survive beyond that single day. It had survived 3 years, sustained by the occasional phone call, and twice by Tommy's dad arranging for his son to tag along on a facility visit specifically so the boys could waste an afternoon together. The closest thing to a normal childhood friendship Izuku Midoriya had ever managed to build, hidden like everything else that mattered to him, somewhere his mother never thought to look. He was pounding on the front door before he'd fully worked out what he was going to say. Tommy answered it himself, wide-eyed, phone still pressed to his ear, and the relief that crossed his face at the sight of Izuku standing on his porch was almost immediately swallowed by alarm. "Izuku, what the hell, man, are you? Is that BLD? What happened to you? Why do you look like? Where's your mom?" Izuku said, his voice coming out flatter and stranger than he intended. "Is she home? Is your dad?" "Mom's inside, Dad's stuck at the Dallas facility. Phones have been down for an hour. I can't get through to him." Tommy's own voice cracked on the last word, and Izuku understood, with a fresh wave of guilt he had no idea yet how to hold, that DFW was already gone, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter, and that whatever had happened to Preston Cole's flight had very likely already happened to the man who'd introduced them 3 years ago on a warehouse tour. "Izuku, what is going on? The news is saying it's some kind of new sickness, some green fever thing. My mom won't stop watching it. Can I come in?" Izuku said, and something in his face must have finally answered every question Tommy hadn't quite managed to ask, because the older boy stepped back from the door without another word. Deborah Miller was sitting 3 feet from the television when they came in, the remote forgotten in her lap, and she didn't look away from the screen even when her son said her name. The national feed had already begun to fray by then, the calm, practiced DLVRY of the anchors giving way, minute by minute, to the specific unraveling that happens when the people reading a script realize the script no longer applies to the world outside their studio windows. A field correspondent in Atlanta cut out mid-sentence, replaced by dead air, and then, jarringly, an unrelated commercial for laundry detergent that no one had thought to pull. A banner scrolled along the bottom of the screen listing city after city under some form of emergency declaration, the list growing visibly longer between one commercial break and the next. "They're saying it's airborne now," Deborah said, not turning around, her voice pitched somewhere between disbelief and a terror so total it had flattened out into something almost calm. "They were saying contact only, and now they're saying it might be airborne, and nobody can tell me a straight answer about whether we're supposed to stay or go." The feed cut, without warning, to a local affiliate, a studio anchor mid-sentence, composed, professional, running through a segment on evacuation routes that had clearly been assembled in the last hour. And Izuku had just enough time to register the anchor's face, calm and practiced under the studio lights, before the wall behind her exploded inward in a spray of glass and drywall dust. Deborah screamed. Tommy grabbed for the remote, as if turning it off could somehow undo what they'd just watched, but Izuku's hand shot out and stopped him, some cold, analytical part of his mind already cataloging every detail even as the rest of him recoiled in horror. The thing that came through the wall had been human recently enough that its clothes still fit. A torn blazer, a name badge still clipped, absurdly, to its lapel, but everything else about it had already gone somewhere else entirely. Skin gone waxy and green-gray, one eye clouded to a slitted yellow, jaw hanging loose and wrong. It moved with the same jerking, hyper-adrenalized violence Izuku had watched Elias Vance's body learn less than a day earlier, and it crossed the studio floor in 3 strides before the anchor could do more than turn her head, and the broadcast, the entire nation's window into a crisis it still didn't understand, went dark mid-scream, replaced a half-second later by a blue technical difficulty screen that felt somehow more obscene than anything that had come before it. Nobody in the Miller living room said anything for almost a full minute. "That was live," Tommy finally said, very quietly, staring at the blue screen. "Izuku, that was live television." They watched the street instead, after that, because the street felt, absurdly, safer than the television, a thing you could see with your own eyes instead of filtered through a broadcast that had just proven it couldn't protect anyone from anything. The chaos started at the end of the cul-de-sac, 3 houses down, close enough that Izuku could make out every terrible detail from the Miller's front window. A car, a family sedan, The kind that belonged to somebody's dad, somebody's ordinary Tuesday. Swerved hard across 2 lawns and came to rest half buried in a hedge, and the driver stumbled out of it clutching his own head, already changing in ways that no longer surprised Izuku even as they turned his stomach. His wife came running from the front porch, screaming his name, "Marcus, Marcus, oh my God, Marcus," and reached for him with both hands, still believing, in the last few seconds she would ever believe anything again, that this was a man having a medical emergency and not a man who had already functionally stopped being one. He turned on her before she'd finished saying his name. Tommy made a sound low in his throat and grabbed his mother's arm, pulling her back from the window. "We have to go," Izuku said, his voice steadying into something hard and clear even as his hands shook. "Now. We can't stay here. This whole neighborhood is going to be exactly like that within the hour. We need to be somewhere else before it is." "Go where?" Deborah demanded, already moving toward the stairs, some deep animal instinct overriding her shock even faster than her son's. "My husband is still in Dallas. I am not leaving this house without knowing." "You can't reach Dallas," Izuku said, and hated himself for the flatness in his own voice even as he said it, because it was the truth and there was no version of that sentence that could be made kind. "The phones are down because the network's down, and the network's down because of exactly what's happening on your television right now. Mrs. Miller, I promise you the single best thing you can do for your husband, if there's any chance at all he's still out there, is to still be alive yourself when this is over so he has somewhere to come home to." She looked at him for a long, terrible second. This 14-year-old boy standing in her living room covered in BLD that wasn't his, speaking with an authority that belonged to nobody that age, and something in his certainty seemed to reach her in a way nothing else had. "Get the go-bag from the hall closet," she said to Tommy, her voice cracking but steadying underneath the crack. "Get your father's truck keys. We're leaving." They made it 4 blocks before the truck stalled out in gridlock, so complete it might as well have been a parking lot, every driveway on every street emptying at once, horns screaming into a chorus that no longer meant anything because there was nowhere for anyone to actually go. Deborah was the one who spotted the family 2 houses down, an elderly couple frozen on their porch, clearly too frightened and too frail to have any plan of their own, and something in her simply couldn't leave them standing there. "Get him out through the side streets," she told the boys, already climbing out of the truck. "I'll bring the Hendersons. We'll catch up on foot if we have to." "Mom, no." Tommy started, but she was already moving, already jogging toward the porch, already calling out to the old man to take her arm. And the crush of the crowd, dozens of neighbors, all fleeing in the same narrow window between the same 2 houses, swallowed her from view before either boy could reach her. They called her name until their throats gave out. They searched the crowd until the crowd itself became a danger, until the first shrieks of something that wasn't human anymore started rising from somewhere back toward the cul-de-sac, and every instinct either of them had left screamed at them to run instead of stand still. In the end, it was Izuku who made the decision neither of them could bear to make out loud, pulling Tommy bodily away from the crush, toward the tree line at the edge of the development, because staying to search any longer meant staying to die, and there was by then nothing else left in that neighborhood worth dying for. They never found her. They never learned what happened to her at all. They ran until the paved streets gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to nothing but hard-packed dirt and mesquite scrub, deep into the low, folding hills west of the city, until Tommy's legs finally buckled beneath him, and he went down HRD on his knees in the dust, chest heaving, and simply couldn't make himself get back up. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't, Izuku, I can't do this anymore. My mom is back there. My dad might be." "I know," Izuku said, and dropped down beside him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. They sat like that until the sun went down and the temperature dropped and the first stars came out over a sky that, for one strange, aching moment, looked exactly the way it always had, as if the entire world hadn't just come apart at every seam it owned. Then the light on the eastern horizon changed. It started as a low, orange smear along the skyline, distant enough that at first Tommy mistook it for sunset in the wrong direction. And then it bloomed. A series of controlled, deliberate flashes, each one followed several seconds later by a low, rolling boom that reached them across the hills like distant thunder. The military, in what would turn out to be one of the last coordinated actions any government body managed to complete before the whole apparatus of organized response simply stopped functioning, had made the calculation that a burning city was better than an uncontained one, and had begun, systematically, to firebomb the heart of Austin. The horizon kept blooming for almost 20 minutes, silent orange flowers unfolding one after another, and from their ridge 2 miles out, the boys watched a skyline they'd both grown up under start to disappear behind a wall of smoke lit from beneath in colors that had no business looking as appealing as they did. "What is this?" Tommy said, very quietly, not really a question, his face lit orange and hollow in the distant firelight. "What is happening, Izuku?" And Izuku Midoriya, 14 years old, sat on a hillside 2 miles outside the city he had just watched burn, and understood that he owed this boy, the only person on the entire ruined map of his life who had never once wanted anything from him except his company, the one thing he had been too much of a coward to say to anyone else all day. "It's me, Tommy," he said, and the words tore loose from somewhere so deep in his chest it felt like something physically breaking. "The formula. My formula. This is all my mistake." He told him everything in a flat, exhausted voice that had nothing performed left in it at all. Finch and Vance, and the flag on the monitor he'd let Strom talk him out of, and the security team, and Connors going back up the stairwell one last time, and the drive still zipped into his jacket that he hadn't let himself set down once since he'd ripped it from the server port. He told him because Tommy deserved to know exactly whose fault the world burning behind them actually was, and because some small, exhausted 14-year-old part of him simply couldn't carry it alone for one more second. Tommy didn't say anything for a long time. Izuku watched something shift in his friend's face in the firelight. Not anger, not yet, something closer to a kind of grief that had nowhere left to go, the specific look of someone watching the last uncomplicated thing in his life quietly finish dying right alongside everything else. The boy who had handed him wrenches and talked about carburetors, who had never once needed Izuku to be extraordinary, was gone from that hillside by the time the fires finally started to burn down, replaced by someone who understood, now, exactly what kind of world he was going to have to survive in, and exactly whose hands had built it. They didn't speak again for the rest of the night. They simply sat there on the cooling hillside, two children who had both lost everything within the same 24 hours, and watched the only home either of them had ever known burn down to ash and embers on the horizon, and somewhere behind them, in the darkness of the hills, the first sounds, low, wet, hungry, of a world that no longer belonged to people like them had already begun. 20 years is long enough to forget the sound a city is supposed to make. Boston, before, had never gone quiet. Not really, not even at 3 in the morning, not with the harbor traffic and the late trains and the drunks stumbling out of bars and Southey singing something off-key. Boston now, when quiet the way a held breath goes quiet, broken only by the low, constant drone of the generator banks strung along what used to be Commonwealth Avenue, the rhythmic tramp of Continental Authority boots on checkpoint rotation, and, somewhere underneath all of it, if you knew how to listen for it the way 20 years had taught a man to listen for it, the faint, wet click of something patient waiting in the dark beneath the old subway grates. Midoriya had stopped calling it Boston a long time ago. It was just the zone now. Zone 7, on the authorities' official paperwork, though nobody who actually lived inside its checkpoints and curfew lines bothered with the number. It was the zone, the same way every other fortified husk of a city scattered across what used to be a country was just the zone to the people who'd been born too late to remember it as anything else. He moved through the common sector a little after 4 in the morning, hood up, pack slung tight against his back, so it wouldn't shift and give away his position by sound, following a route he could have walked with his eyes shut, because he'd walked it, in one variation or another, close to 1,000 times over the last 6 years. 20 years had turned the boy who'd once stood in front of a board of directors reciting genomic deviation percentages into a man built along entirely different lines, broad through the shoulders now in a way that had nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with 2 decades of carrying, climbing, hauling, and occasionally killing whatever needed to be killed to survive the night. His green hair had darkened and grayed at the temples, kept short and rough with a knife rather than scissors. A beard, unevenly trimmed, covered a jaw that carried 3 separate scars nobody had ever bothered asking the story behind, because in the zone, asking about somebody's scars was its own kind of insult. It assumed they were rare enough to be worth remarking on. He kept a hunting knife on his hip and a battered revolver in a holster stitched into the inside of his jacket by his own hand. 6 rounds loaded and 4 more rattling loose in a jacket pocket, because ammunition was too precious in this life to waste on a full spare cylinder. He kept a small leather notebook, water-stained and swollen at the spine, tucked into an inside pocket where his heart used to keep other things. Nobody who dealt with him in the zone's black markets knew what was written in it, and nobody had ever been stupid enough to ask. They called him Midoriya. Just that. He had let the other name go the way you let go of a hand you can't hold on to anymore without it dragging you under. Not forgotten, never forgotten, just filed somewhere so far back that it belonged to a different person entirely. A boy in a lab coat 2 sizes too big who had genuinely, stupidly, believed the world could be fixed. He reached the drop point. A boarded storefront that had once sold something as absurd, in retrospect, as scented candles, and rapped twice, paused, then twice more against the plywood covering the doorway. A slat shifted an inch, one eye visible in the gap. "Password," said a voice, rough with age and cigarette smoke that shouldn't have existed 20 years into a supply chain collapse, but somehow, in the zone, always did. "You never actually set one, Otis," Midoriya said. "You just like making people say the word password." A wet, wheezing laugh from behind the boards, and the slat pulled back far enough to let him through into a narrow room lit by a single battery lantern. Shelves along the back wall stocked with the kind of inventory that would have gotten a man arrested in the old world and gotten a man killed for hoarding in this one. Antibiotics, batteries, a locked case of ammunition, a handful of pre-outbreak canned goods, so old the labels had faded to nothing. "You bring what I asked for," Otis said, not a question, already reaching under the counter. Midoriya swung the pack off his shoulder and set it down with the careful precision of a man handling something more valuable than his own life, which, in a functional sense, it currently was. 6 vials of insulin, scavenged 3 days earlier from a collapsed pharmacy 2 sectors over, kept cold the entire way back in a rag soaked with water he'd been rationing for exactly that purpose. 6 units. Cold chain's been broken maybe an hour, tops. You've got a family in Zone 4 who needs this by morning or there. Kid doesn't wake up, so don't sit on it. Otis inspected the vials with the practiced squint of a man who'd once, before all of this, apparently been something closer to an actual pharmacist, and grunted his approval. "Payment's what we agreed. Half now, half when Tess confirms the second half of your ask went through clean." He slid a small canvas pouch across the counter. A handful of ration stamps, 2 boxes of ammunition, a folded slip of paper that would get the bearer past the Zone 6 checkpoint without the usual hour-long questioning. "She's not with you tonight?" "Different job," Midoriya said, tucking the pouch away inside his jacket. "She'll be back at the safe house by now. We're heading out first thing to see a man about some guns he owes us." "Careful out there," Otis said, already turning back to his shelves. The conversation over the way conversations in the zone always ended, abrupt, unsentimental, nobody wasting breath on goodbyes that might not mean anything by the next time you saw each other. "Heard there's a Lizain nest gone active in the old T-tunnel under Park Street. Patrol lost 2 men down there last week and didn't even find the bodies." "Noted," Midoriya said, and slipped back out through the plywood door into a street gone the particular deep, dead quiet of 4 in the morning, and started the walk home. Home, such as the word still meant anything, was a 3rd-floor walk-up in a building that had survived the initial bombing runs mostly by luck, its windows boarded from the inside, its door reinforced with a steel bar that took 2 people to lift into place. He and Tess had claimed it 4 years ago after the previous occupants. He'd never asked and never wanted to know exactly what had happened to them, had simply stopped being around to defend it. She wasn't back yet. He noticed it the way he noticed everything now, immediately, without letting the noticing show on his face, cataloging it as a fact rather than letting it become a feeling. The second cot untouched, the kettle cold on its hook, the particular stillness of a room that should have had one more person moving through it by now. Her deal, a straightforward trade, medicine for ammunition, with a contact she'd worked with a dozen times before out past the old distillery district, should have had her back a full hour before he was. He gave it another 20 minutes, pacing a slow, controlled loop between the boarded window and the door, running through the specific mental checklist 20 years of exactly this kind of waiting had taught him to run through. How long is late before late means dead? What's the fastest route to the distillery? Do I go now, or do I give her the benefit of the doubt she's earned 1,000 times over? Before the sound he'd been listening for finally came, 2 soft raps, a pause, 1 hard knock. Their code. And he had the bar off the door before she'd finished the sequence. Tess Servopoulos came through the doorway favoring her left side. One hand pressed to a split lip already swelling dark, her jacket torn at the shoulder seam, and the specific controlled fury on her face of a woman who had survived something and was already, before she'd even sat down, planning exactly how she intended to make somebody pay for it. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask, dropping into the room's single chair with a wince she tried and failed to hide. "Before you get that look on your face. I'm fine. You're bleeding. I'm fine and I'm bleeding. Both things can be true." She pulled her jacket off and let it fall to the floor, probing gingerly at a bruise already darkening along her ribs. 2 of them. Younger than us, anyway, which isn't saying much these days. Jumped me 2 blocks from the drop. Must have been watching the distillery, waiting for somebody to come out carrying something worth taking. Midoriya was already crouched in front of her with the first aid kit before she'd finished the sentence. The same automatic, unromantic care he'd shown her 100 times before, checking the split lip, the ribs, watching her eyes for the specific dilation that would tell him a concussion was worth worrying about more than the rest of it. "Talk," he said, not looking up from her ribs. "All of it. They wanted the ammo I'd traded for. I gave them a fight instead. Got one good enough that he's going to be pissing BLD for a week, but there were 2 of them and 1 of me, and I lost the ammo box in the scuffle before I got clear." Her jaw tightened. "That's not even the part that's got me pissed, Midoriya. The part that's got me pissed is I got back to check the second stash. The guns, the ones we've been sitting on for the Diaz trade, and half the cash is gone. Clean gone. Somebody's been in that lockup, and it wasn't the 2 idiots who jumped me tonight because they didn't know where I was headed until after." Midoriya sat back on his heels and looked at her for a long moment, the pieces already assembling themselves in the cold, methodical part of his mind that had never fully stopped working the way it had once worked over a genome map. "Robert," he said. "Robert." Tess agreed, and there was nothing in her voice but flat, cold certainty. "He's the only other person who's ever had access to that lockup besides us. He's had that key for 2 years because we trusted him to move overflow inventory when we're both out on jobs. And he's been getting Kager every time I've dealt with him the last month. Jumpy, wouldn't meet my eyes, kept changing the subject whenever I brought up the cash count." She pressed a rag to her split lip and looked at him over it, and something old and grim passed between them. 20 years of exactly this kind of shorthand needing no further explanation. "We're going to go have a conversation with him. Tonight? First light." She winced as he finished taping her ribs, but didn't ask him to stop. Didn't ask him to be gentler, because gentleness wasn't a currency either of them traded in much anymore. "I want to hit him before he's had time to think of a story that actually holds together." Robert Aldana ran his fence business out of what had once been a parking garage 2 sectors east, the lower level converted into a rough market floor where a man with the right connections could move nearly anything. Weapons, medicine, information, sometimes people, though he'd always sworn up and down to Tess that he drew a hard line at that last one. He was a thin, nervous man in his 40s with a habit of touching his own throat when he lied, a tell Tess had clocked years ago and had simply never bothered telling him she'd noticed. He was touching his throat within 4 seconds of seeing them walk in. "Tess, Midoriya. Hey, this is a nice surprise. I wasn't expecting." "Cut it," Tess said, and the flat, quiet violence underneath the word made 2 nearby traders find urgent business at the far end of the garage floor without needing to be told twice. "Where's our inventory, Robert?" "I don't." "What inventory? I don't know what you're—" "The lockup," Midoriya said, stepping up beside her, his voice carrying none of Tess's heat, which somehow made it worse, the specific cold, patient tone of a man who had learned a long time ago that patience got answers faster than shouting ever did. "Half our cash. Gone. You're the only other person with a key." Robert's hand found his throat again, and this time he didn't seem to notice he'd done it. Look, I can explain, okay? I didn't have a choice. They came to me. I didn't go looking for this." "Who came to you?" Tess said. "The Fireflies," Robert said. And the 2 words seemed to physically deflate him, his shoulders dropping, the nervous energy draining out into something closer to resignation. I owed them, Tess. I owed them from before you two even knew me, a debt that goes back years. And they came collecting last week, and I didn't have the cash to cover it, so he gestured helplessly at the empty space where their inventory used to sit. I gave them what I had access to. I'm sorry. Genuinely, I never wanted it to be your stock. I just didn't have another. The rest of the sentence never came out, because Tess's pistol was already up, already level with the bridge of his nose, and something in her face had gone past anger into a place with no more room left for negotiation. Tess, Midoriya started, one hand half raised. Not quite a command, not quite fast enough. You sold our guns, Tess said, her voice perfectly, terribly level, to cover your debt, and you didn't think that was worth a conversation before you did it. I panicked. I swear to God, I was going to make it right. I was going to find a way to... She shot him twice, fast, the sound cracking flat and huge across the empty concrete of the garage floor, and Robert Aldana was on the ground before the echo finished rolling off the far wall. And it was over, the way violence in the zone was almost always over. Quick, unglamorous, no music swelling underneath it. Just a man who had made a bad decision and a woman who had run out of patience for hearing him explain it. Midoriya didn't flinch. He'd stopped flinching at this particular kind of ending a very long time ago. He crouched instead, checked the body with the same efficient, unbothered motion he'd have used checking a lock, confirmed there was nothing worth salvaging that hadn't already been taken, and stood back up. Fireflies, he said, testing the word, turning it over the way he still, 20 years on, turned over every new variable before deciding how much weight it deserved. That's who's got our stock. That's who's got our stock. Tess agreed, holstering her weapon, her breathing already steadying back toward normal with the practice speed of someone who had done this often enough that it no longer cost her much to recover from. You know what that means? It means we go find them and ask for it back. It means, Tess said, already turning toward the exit, we go find them and ask for it back. And if Marlene's running things the way I hear she's running things these days, she doesn't hand over stolen goods for free. She trades. Everything with that woman is a trade. She glanced back at him, something sharp and assessing in her expression, the look she got whenever she was 3 steps ahead of a conversation and waiting for him to catch up. You ready for whatever that trade turns out to be, Midoriya? He looked down at Robert's body one last time, at the particular, ordinary tragedy of a man who'd made one bad call too many in a world that no longer forgave bad calls, and thought, distantly, of a locked door in a lab 3 states and 20 years away, and of every version of himself that had ever stood in a room and had to decide, fast, with no good option left on the table, which cost he was willing to pay. I've been ready for whatever this world throws at me for 20 years, he said, and followed her out into the gray light of a morning that had no idea yet how completely it was about to change both their lives. Let's go find the fireflies. This marks the end of part 1 of What If Genius Deku Created the Ultimate Regeneration Formula. A big thanks to Mr. Wonder King 12 for granting the permission to feature this amazing fanfiction. Please like the video and subscribe to Deku Universe for more interesting stories. Thank you, and see you soon.